Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into a world where reason and superstition share the same dinner table, where priests bless storms, farmers whisper to scarecrows, and your neighbor's cat might actually be Satan in disguise. You probably won't survive this one without losing a little faith in human logic. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And, hey, I'm curious, what country are you watching from and what time is it there? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk along a cobbled medieval street still glistening from a recent rain, the scent of smoke and damp wool hanging in the air like history's perfume. Above you, the stars look sharp enough to cut, though no one around you dares to gaze for too long. They're afraid of what's written up there. You pass by a candle seller humming a hymn that's half prayer, half protection spell. Because in this age, light doesn't just push back darkness, it's supposed to keep away demons too. Every corner hides a story, every shadow a superstition, and as you step further into this timeline of trembling belief, you realize medieval people didn't just live among myths, they inhaled them like oxygen. The baker you meet in a crooked doorway genuinely believes fairies can spoil dough, so he leaves crumbs out as an offering. A blacksmith hangs a dead frog above his forge to stop iron from rusting, which sounds disgusting until you realize he's one of the wealthiest men in town. That's the paradox of the Middle Ages. Intellect and ignorance waltzing hand in hand beneath the same church bells. Somewhere nearby, a scholar copies Aristotle by candlelight, while his wife swears she saw a ghost tugging the bedsheet last night. The mainstream fact hiding beneath all this is that medieval Europe, contrary to what modern jokes imply, wasn't entirely lost in darkness. Universities like Paris, Bologna, and Oxford were already dissecting nature, reason, and logic. But knowledge had to survive beside folklore, and both sides tolerated each other in an awkward truce. The fringe tidbit you can't help but smile at. Some chroniclers sincerely claimed that beavers bit off their own testicles to escape hunters, a tale that somehow ended up in moral sermons about temptation. And the scholarly debate still lingering in modern history departments. Did medieval Europeans actually believe every myth, or did they play along for comfort? You can't help but suspect it's a bit like today's horoscopes. Some believe, some pretend, and everyone enjoys the story. The street narrows ahead, torches flickering against cracked walls that have absorbed centuries of whispered fears. You hear a child laugh and swear he's seen a saint appear in the smoke from a chimney, and the adults nod rather than argue. It's easier that way. In the distance, a bell tolls 9 times, marking both bedtime and the boundary between safety and whatever else wanders after dark. You keep walking, hearing dogs bark at nothing, feeling the cobblestones pulse faintly beneath your feet as if the earth itself remembers every myth humanity ever told. You pass an apothecary selling potions labeled against envy and for love's assurance, and for a fleeting moment you wonder if maybe belief itself is the most powerful ingredient. The air grows colder, a sign that the night is deepening or that something unseen just brushed by you. You breathe slowly, letting the sounds of clattering shutters and distant hymns blend into a medieval lullaby. Here, truth doesn't matter as much as faith, and facts, if they even exist, must dress up as stories to survive. You glance back once more at the sleeping town, realizing this entire world runs on imagination with just enough logic to keep the bread from burning. Tomorrow, they'll wake up and argue about dragons, demons, and the shape of the earth, and somehow it'll all make perfect sense to them. For now, though, you just listen to the rhythm of superstition, the heartbeat of a world where myths aren't legends yet, they're reality waiting to be rewritten in the morning light. You wander farther down the path until the cobblestones fade into dirt and the horizon stretches like an uncertain promise, and it's here, on the edge of the known world, that you meet the most famous myth of all, the one that insists the earth is flatter than your breakfast table and twice as dangerous to fall off. The idea sounds almost comical now, like a child's fear of tumbling from a playground slide, but in the medieval imagination, it carried the weight of eternity. You picture a sailor gripping the ship's railing, his knuckles pale, staring into the horizon as though it hides a lip of reality itself. The sea, after all, was not an empty expanse. It was a breathing creature, and to cross too far was to flirt with oblivion. Yet the historical fact quietly humming behind the legend is that most educated people of the Middle Ages didn't actually believe in a flat earth. Scholars from as early as the 6th century, like the monk Isidore of Seville, described it as a sphere, and every serious university taught the same. The real issue wasn't shape, it was what lurked beyond. You imagine sailors telling each other tales over cheap ale, whispering about phantom waterfalls and whirlpools big enough to swallow fleets whole. Someone probably added that the horizon shimmered because sunlight bounced off heaven's rim, and everyone nodded, not wanting to risk blasphemy or boredom. The quirky tidbit buried in all this is that medieval maps, those glorious mappa mundi, often squeezed Jerusalem into the center of everything and politely ignored Australia's entire existence. The cartographers weren't confused, they were poetic. To them, maps weren't just navigation tools, they were theological diagrams dressed in geography's clothing. One of the open scholarly debates still stirring argument today asks whether people's acceptance of a round earth coexisted peacefully with their superstitions about what lived beyond its edges, or whether those myths masked a deep collective anxiety about human limitation itself. You stand before one such parchment in your mind, inked in brown and red, where the world ends in dragons, dog-headed men, and seas of darkness. You can almost feel the tremor of the quill that drew it, a human hand caught between reason and wonder. Somewhere in a coastal village, a priest preaches that curiosity leads to sin, warning parishioners not to chase the edge lest they sail straight into God's patience. But curiosity, as it turns out, has a louder voice than fear. By the late Middle Ages, merchants and explorers began pushing beyond old borders, armed with compasses, faith, and just enough hubris to rewrite the world. Still, as you watch the mist rolling over the imagined rim of the earth, you can't help but admire the symmetry of it all. Humanity terrified of falling, yet desperate to keep walking forward. In taverns, children carve miniature ships and pretend to navigate seas where mermaids sing sailors to their doom. In monasteries, monks debate whether paradise might be a hidden island past the equator. And in your sleepy mind, somewhere between science and superstition, the two begin to look strangely alike, both fueled by longing to know what waits in the dark. The air around you grows salty, the sound of invisible waves lapping gently at your thoughts. You tilt your head upward, feeling the night press closer as though you too are perched on the edge of something vast. Maybe not the world itself, but belief, the fragile frontier where imagination refuses to surrender. Even when reason knocks on the door, you breathe deeply. Let the ocean air sting your nose, and step back from that mythic precipice. For all the centuries of fear and faith, the truth remains beautifully anticlimactic. No one ever fell off the earth, but plenty of people fell into wonder, and maybe that's the more dangerous kind of fall after all. You continue onward, boots damp with dew, until the ground begins to smell faintly of smoke and sulfur. And in the rolling haze of imagination you see it, the curling shadow of a dragon rising from a cave's mouth like a rumor, finally stretching its wings. In the medieval mind, dragons weren't just bedtime monsters, they were cosmic punctuation marks, reminders that somewhere beyond the fields and forests, chaos still had teeth. You imagine farmers spotting strange claw marks on a hillside after a storm and deciding it must have been a dragon dragging its belly across the mud. The truth behind the legend, however, hides quietly in the soil. Many dragon bones displayed in churches and curiosity cabinets were actually fossils of mammoths and dinosaurs, unearthed long before anyone had a vocabulary for extinction. Yet facts seldom ruin a good story. A knight returning from the east might boast of slaying a serpent longer than a ship, and everyone listening would nod, not because they believed him, but because they wanted to. Dragons symbolized every danger people couldn't explain: disease, drought, temptation, and somehow turning those terrors into a single scaly villain made life feel more manageable. The quirky tidbit that always gets overlooked is that in some parts of Europe, villagers genuinely brewed dragon blood medicine, made not from mythical beasts but from a red resin imported from trees, used for everything from healing wounds to polishing armor. Imagine rubbing tree sap on your sword and declaring yourself a dragon hunter. Confidence was the true elixir of the age. The scholarly debate that lingers centuries later asks whether dragon myths were born from universal human fear or shared cross-cultural imagination, a kind of psychological mirror reflecting the same anxiety in different languages. You step closer to the imagined beast, its breath hot and metallic, the glow from its nostrils painting the cave walls orange. It hisses softly, not with malice but exhaustion, as though it's tired of being misunderstood. You realize that for all their terror, dragons were moral lessons wrapped in smoke, each one slain to prove that virtue could conquer chaos. You picture St. George, lance poised, armor gleaming beneath a painted sky, while some medieval painter back in his workshop wrestles with perspective and theology at the same time. Outside, children chase each other with wooden swords, shouting about slaying dragons before supper, unaware that they're echoing myths older than language. And somewhere, an old woman tells her granddaughter that thunder is just a dragon rolling over in its sleep, and suddenly the storm doesn't seem so frightening. The flicker of lightning illuminates your face, and for a moment you could swear you see the curve of a massive tail vanishing into the clouds. You smile, realizing that imagination, once born, never really dies. It just changes shape, waiting for new storytellers to breathe it back into life. As you walk away, the night hums with the low growl of history, reminding you that dragons may have been extinct before humanity existed, but fear and wonder are immortal companions. You keep walking until dawn thins the fog into silver ribbons, and ahead, beyond a row of oaks, you see the shimmer of something impossibly pure, a creature stepping from legend as calmly as a deer, its spiral horn catching the first light like a thread of spun glass. The unicorn, proud emblem of purity and grace, greets you not with neighing majesty, but with the silence of an idea too perfect to exist. In the medieval world, however, perfection didn't need proof. It only needed faith, and faith was the one currency everyone could afford. You move through the hush of the forest where merchants once swore they'd glimpsed these beasts before shipping crates of unicorn horns across Europe at prices higher than gold. The historical fact, amusing in hindsight, is that those horns were actually narwhal tusks from the icy waters of the north, harvested by traders who must have laughed all the way to their counting tables. But laughter, like truth, had little value when nobility was involved. Kings displayed the so-called relics in their treasuries as divine trophies. Queens drank from goblets carved from the tusks, believing the material could detect or neutralize poison. Poison paranoia was the medieval version of internet conspiracy. Everyone swore they knew someone who'd been saved by a unicorn cup. You picture it, a banquet hall heavy with incense and candlelight, a courtier subtly dipping a ring into his wine, whispering a prayer to purity while watching for bubbles that never came. It wasn't just superstition, it was performance, a theater of holiness and hygiene, proving that even royalty longed for reassurance that danger could be tamed by beauty. The quirky tidbit hidden behind the polished myth is that apothecaries once sold powdered unicorn horn as medicine, a cure-all for everything from epilepsy to bad dreams. They ground narwhal tusks into fine white dust and promised that purity, when ingested, could cleanse the soul through the stomach, a charmingly medieval leap of logic, Some cities even issued certificates of authenticity for their unicorn powder, a kind of FDA of fantasy that kept the economy of belief spinning. In the shadowed markets of Venice or Lubeck, sailors unrolled parchment maps dotted with places called "Here be unicorns," proof that even commerce had its own mythology. Scholars today still debate whether medieval people genuinely believed in unicorns as biological creatures or whether they treated them as moral allegories disguised as natural history. The most convincing evidence suggests both belief was layered like stained glass, truth and symbol reflecting each other depending on where the light struck. To the devout, the unicorn symbolized Christ, pure, elusive, captured only by a virgin. To the skeptical, it was a metaphor for the unreachable ideals humanity kept chasing through brambles of faith. You imagine a scribe in a monastery somewhere, his fingers ink-stained and trembling, sketching a unicorn in the margin of a psalm. He doesn't need to have seen one to know it exists. Belief alone fills in the missing anatomy. That perhaps is the most tender secret of the Middle Ages. Imagination was a muscle stronger than evidence. You step closer to the image forming in your mind. A pale creature standing beside a brook, its reflection rippling into illusion. Birds watch quietly, as though even nature hesitates to interrupt the poetry. And you, standing there centuries later in thought, feel that same ache of yearning to see what can't be seen, to touch the impossible. The forest grows denser around you, the air damp and cool, carrying the scent of moss and the faintest sweetness of wild mint. Somewhere, a monk's bell tolls faintly from a hilltop, a sound that somehow fits perfectly inside this dream. But then, as all dreams do, it begins to fray at the edges. You recall that one medieval bishop wrote a treatise arguing unicorns might not be animals at all, but angelic projections sent to test human virtue. Others countered that they were simply too shy to reveal themselves now that mankind had sinned too openly. A theological game of hide and seek that lasted for centuries. Artists kept painting them anyway, tucking them into tapestries beside lilies and maidens, their eyes wide and strangely human. One particularly famous set of French tapestries depicts a unicorn resting in a garden enclosed by a fence, a symbol scholars say of chastity contained, or perhaps freedom misunderstood. You picture the craftsman weaving those scenes, thread by thread, unaware that they're creating an icon that would outlive entire kingdoms. The more you think about it, the more the myth starts to sound like a love story between humanity and hope itself. The unicorn, elusive and immortal, was everything people wanted the world to be, pure, curable, and somehow meaningful. Every age invents its miracles, and the Middle Ages simply preferred theirs to be horse-shaped. The open scholarly debate that still lingers asks whether belief in creatures like the unicorn was a symptom of ignorance or an expression of deeper faith. Was it gullibility or the courage to let beauty rewrite the rules of reality? You find yourself leaning toward the latter. After all, no one ever chased a unicorn for profit alone. They chased it because they needed to believe that purity once lost could be found again. As you move through the clearing, the wind picks up, rustling leaves like the flutter of parchment. You can almost hear the low hum of a medieval marketplace where relics and stories traded hands with equal weight. A merchant shouts about the healing horn of a unicorn freshly slain beyond the Carpathians. A bishop quietly blesses it before purchasing half the supply for the cathedral treasury. Somewhere nearby, a peasant coughs and mutters that he'd rather trust garlic than unicorn dust. You smile, because in the strange arithmetic of history, skepticism has always been the quiet twin of belief. Night begins to fold itself around you again. Shadows soft and amber. The unicorn lingers at the edge of your vision, half real, half reflection. You think of how many centuries it stood as the banner of impossible ideals, from the royal crests of England and Scotland to illuminated manuscripts that turned ink into prayer. and you wonder whether in some small way believing in unicorns kept people gentle in a brutal age. Maybe superstition, for all its absurdities, was just a coded language for hope. The last glimmer of light catches on the imagined horn before fading completely, and for a heartbeat you almost believe it's still out there, wandering through forests that memory forgot, waiting for someone patient enough to believe again. Then the silence deepens, your breath turns visible in the chill, and you walk on, leaving the echo of that myth to graze quietly in the pasture of time. You follow a narrow path between cottages until you smell the acrid tang of soot and something sweeter, maybe herbs burning in a clay bowl, and realize you've stepped into a village that believes the moon controls more than tides. It governs moods, crops, and the boundary between sanity and sin. In the Middle Ages, the night sky was a map of moods. Every flicker of starlight carried meaning, every full moon an omen. The people here live in a rhythm older than science, trusting phases of light and darkness to explain what medicine could not. You pass a crooked wooden fence where bottles are buried neck-deep in the soil, corked with wax and packed with nails, hair, and scraps of cloth. These are witch bottles, protection charms meant to trap curses and reflect them back on whoever wished harm. They clink faintly when the wind shifts, sounding almost like laughter beneath the dirt. You watch a woman in a gray shawl mutter over one, her lips shaping words that blend Latin, prayer, and kitchen gossip in equal measure. She looks up just once, as if sensing your curiosity, then returns to sealing her jar with beeswax. To her, this isn't superstition, it's survival. The historical fact hiding under all this incense and anxiety is that such witch bottles really were used throughout England and Europe from the 16th century onward, often filled with pins, iron filings, and even human urine. Yes, human, because the theory went that by trapping your own essence inside the bottle, you could confuse an attacking spirit. Archaeologists still unearth them beneath doorways and fireplaces, relics of fear disguised as home decor. It's easy to laugh now, but when every illness or stroke of bad luck looked like sorcery, a bottle of one's own bodily fluid seemed a small price for peace of mind. And speaking of the moon, medieval physicians, the respectable, university-trained ones, believed its phases could alter the fluids of the body. Lunar cycles were thought to stir the humors, meaning a full moon might make your blood boil with passion or madness. It's where we get the word lunatic, though no one here finds it funny. You can feel it tonight. The air is heavy, restless, as though the whole village inhales together each time the moon rises. The quirky tidbit that makes you grin despite the eerie setting is that some towns timed haircuts and surgeries to the moon's position, believing wounds healed faster when the moon was waxing. Barbers would hang calendars marked with celestial symbols, promising better luck if you bled under the right constellation. Imagine walking into your local barber and being told your spleen isn't in the mood for scissors today. That's medieval multitasking for you. Theology meets dermatology. And yet these beliefs were not just peasant fancy, they reached the nobility too. Kings consulted astrologers before marriages or wars, certain that stars were God's punctuation marks. One chronicler even wrote that a noble woman refused to give birth until an astrologer declared Mars was out of retrograde, an early form of cosmic scheduling. Scholars still debate whether these practices stemmed from pagan survivals or Christian adaptations. The Church officially condemned astrology, yet quietly used it to plan feast days. Lunar influence became a loophole in theology. It wasn't witchcraft, just observation of divine order. So, the same moon that inspired hymns also dictated when to sow barley or take medicine. You stand there beneath it, the orb hanging huge and yellow, its light frosting the rooftops. Somewhere, dogs howl. Not at ghosts, but perhaps at their own reflection in the myth. A group of villagers gathers near the churchyard, lighting candles and hollowed turnips to chase away spirits. They whisper of moon curses that twist dreams or curdle milk. One man swears his neighbor's eyes gleam silver during full moons, proof enough of sorcery. Another insists he saw his cow speak Latin once, though only on a Tuesday. No one laughs. They just nod gravely, as though life is too short to risk disbelief. You walk among them, your steps muffled by straw. Every few meters stands another charm. A horseshoe nailed upside down, a sprig of rowan wood, a child's shoe bricked into a wall to confuse fairies. The air hums with nervous energy, the kind that precedes either a festival or a panic. A baker offers you bread shaped like a crescent, baked tonight for protection. You take a bite, and it tastes faintly of ash and superstition. In that moment you realize how these myths stitched comfort into chaos. For people with no antibiotics, no streetlights, and plenty of unexplained noises after dark, magic wasn't irrational. It was management. You step closer to the well at the village's heart, noticing symbols carved into its stones, crosses, circles, and moons, overlapping in a dizzying geometry. Locals say witches hate running water, so wells and streams became spiritual fortresses. A mother dips her fingers in the water and touches her baby's forehead, murmuring words older than her language. It's oddly tender, this dance between fear and love. Even superstition bends toward protection. You think back to the flat earth believers and the dragon slayers from earlier, realizing that all these myths, however absurd, share one heartbeat: control. Humanity builds stories when it can't build certainty. A bell rings from the small chapel, and the villagers scatter indoors, locking shutters as though night itself is a contagion. You linger a moment, listening to the insects, the crackle of hearths behind wooden doors, and the rhythmic drip of water from the well. Then you notice a jar wedged between two stones, another witch bottle, half buried and gleaming faintly in moonlight. Inside, something moves. Maybe just a trapped bubble of air. Maybe your imagination. You lean closer, half hoping for a sign, half dreading one. Then a tiny pop breaks the silence, and the wax seal loosens, releasing a wisp of scent: salt, iron, and rosemary. Nothing supernatural, just chemistry and time conspiring to spook you. Still, you step back quickly. Even the rational mind prefers distance from someone else's superstition. As you leave the square, you glance up once more at the swollen moon. It hangs like a pale coin above the world, indifferent yet endlessly observed. You think about how, centuries later, humans would walk on it and leave footprints where fear once stood. But even now, somewhere, someone still checks their horoscope before making a big decision. Old habits like moonlight die slowly. The myth persists, not because it's true, but because it's beautiful, because it gives shape to the unseen, and a reason to look up when everything else feels uncertain. You smile at the thought, pull your cloak tighter, and walk toward the darker forest ahead, where, rumor has it, the builders of cathedrals once claimed giants lent them a hand. The night swallows your footsteps, and the whisper of the moon follows, soft as breath, reminding you that belief, however strange, was humanity's first light in the dark. You cross from the whispering forest into open hills where stone towers pierce the horizon, half-finished spires reaching like frozen prayers toward the clouds, and you realize you've arrived at the heart of another medieval miracle, architecture so impossibly grand that ordinary people refuse to believe human hands built it at all. The story goes that giants, fallen angels, or even demons with suspiciously good work ethic helped raise the cathedrals of Europe stone by stone. You can almost hear the chisel strikes echoing through centuries, ghostly rhythms of ambition meeting myth. To stand before a medieval cathedral is to stand at the intersection of devotion and delusion. You tilt your head back and see gargoyles grinning down, their twisted faces daring you to question whether this was faith or fear carved into limestone. In Paris, in Chartres, in Cologne, everywhere a spire punctured the sky. People whispered that it couldn't possibly be the work of mere mortals. The mainstream historical fact, of course, is that these cathedrals were feats of engineering brilliance, built by guilds of stonemasons who passed down geometry and craft like sacred inheritance. They used nothing supernatural, just math, muscle, and generations of patience. But it's the waiting, you think, that made miracles believable. When a church took 2 centuries to complete, builders were long dead before their own sons saw the roof closed, so it made sense that unseen forces must have carried on the work in the meantime. The myth of giants filled that absence. In many towns, people swore they'd heard thundering footsteps at night around half-built cathedrals, as if colossal stonemasons finished their shifts under the moon. Some legends even claimed the devil himself laid the foundations of certain bridges and towers, bargaining for the first soul to cross. That's how you know humanity will always find a way to turn labor into legend. If a building seems impossible, blame it on someone with horns. The quirky tidbit buried in this pile of limestone and faith is that in the city of Beauvais, France, where the tallest Gothic choir ever attempted later collapsed, locals explained the disaster by saying the angels who once supported it grew tired of holding such arrogance. Architectural overconfidence rebranded as celestial fatigue, that's medieval spin doctoring at its finest. You wander through scaffolding made of wood, darker than time itself, your footsteps stirring dust that smells faintly of iron and incense. A mason hums nearby, chiseling with a rhythm so sure it might as well be prayer. He glances at you briefly, as though recognizing a fellow believer not in religion but in repetition. You realize these workers built cathedrals not just for glory, but for survival. Their contracts promised wages, meals, and eternal salvation all in one. The scholarly debate that lingers even now is whether the workers truly believed in divine assistance or whether the stories of giants were invented by later generations seeking to dignify the impossible. Historians argue that myth served as medieval project management. It kept morale alive when progress moved at the speed of moss growth. You walk beneath an unfinished arch, light slanting through, and the air hums like a throat about to sing. Somewhere above, a gargoyle spits a thin stream of rainwater down into a puddle that mirrors the rising tower. Those grotesque faces you remember weren't just decoration, they were warnings, guardians meant to frighten evil spirits away. Ironically, they terrified the very villagers who donated coins to pay for them. You imagine a mother clutching her child's hand, pointing at the stone beasts and whispering that they come alive at midnight to chase demons, never realizing that the legend she's spreading will outlast the building itself. The wind whistles through hollow scaffolds, and for a moment you almost hear the groan of giants, the moan of ropes strained by miracles. You find a half-carved inscription near the apse, Deus fecit, non homo, God made this, not man. The irony stings, anonymous masons carving divine credit above their own sweat, yet maybe they didn't see it as humility, but as insurance. If a spire fell, no one could accuse them of hubris if the work belonged to heaven. These cathedrals were the internet of their day, connecting souls across countries through shared awe. Pilgrims carried tales like currency. The glass at Chartres glowed with heavenly fire. The columns at Durham sang hymns in the wind. The bell at Cologne rang by itself when the world was in danger. Belief filled the gaps where physics ended. The smell of wet stone mixes with candle smoke as you step inside one of these towering sanctuaries. The nave stretches so high it could swallow the night sky. You listen to your own breath bouncing off ribs of stone, and it feels like standing inside a fossilized prayer. Workers shuffle along scaffolds above, their silhouettes haloed in dust. You imagine what it must have felt like for a peasant entering such a space for the first time, walking from mud and disease into a chamber of light. Of course they believed giants built it. It looked like heaven had descended. A single beam of sun sneaks through a stained glass window, spilling crimson and sapphire across the floor, colors so rich you can taste them. The image in glass shows the Virgin holding a tower. The Virgin is architect, because even the saints got promotion credits in this era. Outside again, you circle the grounds, noticing strange carvings on cornerstones, enormous footprints, half human, half bird. One legend says those were left by the Watchers, angels banished for loving mortals, condemned to help humans build God's houses as penance. The Masons probably carved them for fun, but myths never waste a good symbol. And somewhere between your imagination and the dust under your boots, you start to feel what those builders felt, a fragile pride balanced on fear. For them, faith wasn't abstract, it was masonry. Every chisel stroke risked death, every arch a prayer in stone. You pause before a broken statue lying in the grass, an angel missing its head. Someone has placed a candle beside it, still flickering though the wax has nearly melted away. You crouch down and touch the marble. It's cold, heavy, perfect, and you think of the human need to turn back-breaking labor into magic. Giants didn't build these cathedrals. Belief did. Belief that geometry could be holy, that sweat could buy salvation, that beauty could outlast suffering. Perhaps that's why, even now, the idea of giants doesn't feel insulting. It feels right, because in their own way, the builders were giants, anonymous, strong, reaching beyond their lifetimes. The last light fades, and you look up one final time at the towers spearing the dusk. You imagine the workers gone, their bones dust beneath the floor, their whispers still circling the nave. The wind moans through empty scaffolds, sounding uncannily like laughter. You smile, realizing that every myth begins as a compliment disguised as fear. The people didn't believe giants built cathedrals because they doubted humans. They believed it because the work looked too glorious for mere mortals. And maybe, deep down, that's still how we feel when we stand before anything magnificent, a skyscraper, a symphony, a story that refuses to die. The myth remains not because it's wrong, but because it's comforting to imagine we're not alone in building wonders too large for our own hands. You take one last step backward, the towers shrinking only slightly against the infinite gray sky, and whisper to yourself, half in jest, half in prayer, "All right, giants, clock out for the night." The echo carries softly, and, for a fleeting heartbeat, it almost sounds like they laugh back. You walk from the towering cathedrals into the bustle of a marketplace where traders shout in half a dozen languages and the air smells of leather, smoke, and the faint earthy tang of wet animal skin. Among the stalls selling salt, wool, and relics, one merchant stands out. His table gleams with polished stones that shimmer faintly under the cloudy light. He swears each one was taken from the head of a toad. You laugh quietly, thinking he's joking, but his expression doesn't flinch. Welcome to the age of the toadstone, the medieval miracle gem that everyone wanted in their purse or their pocket, because it was said to protect you from poison and, conveniently, bad luck. The idea that a common toad, nature's squat little grump, could grow a jewel inside its skull might sound absurd now, but in the Middle Ages it fit perfectly into a world where every creature was thought to hold some secret virtue, if only you knew how to harvest it. The mainstream historical fact is that toadstones were actually fossils, usually the polished teeth of ancient fish like lepidotes, dug up and sold by enterprising merchants who saw opportunity in confusion. But in a world where science was still half sorcery, who could resist a stone that promised to save your life? It was said that if you wore a toadstone set in silver, it would sweat or change color when you were near poison. Nobles carried them to banquets the way we carry smartphones, constantly checking for signs of danger. Poisoning, after all, was the medieval version of corporate espionage. Everyone feared it, few understood it, and everyone believed someone else was plotting it. You picture a candlelit feast, goblets of wine, roasted pheasant, the hum of gossip under the music. A lord raises his cup, glances at the ring on his finger, and sighs with relief when it stays dry. The superstition became so fashionable that jewelers even drilled tiny holes into pebbles to fake the toadstone look, turning fraud into fine art. The quirky tidbit you can't help but adore is that people genuinely thought you could retrieve a toadstone by placing a live toad inside an anthill and waiting for the ants to eat away the flesh, leaving the magic gem behind. Imagine the patience that required, not to mention the sheer audacity of inventing pest-assisted mining. In some versions, the toad had to be wrapped in cloth first, to prevent it from hopping away mid-sacrifice. It's the kind of story that reveals more about human creativity than amphibian biology. You stroll between the stalls, the mud sucking lightly at your boots, and hear a woman whispering a charm under her breath while buying one of the stones. She tucks it into her bodice with the solemnity of a religious rite. A man nearby sells powdered versions mixed into tiny packets, promising they can cure snake bites, heartache, and spiritual laziness, 3 equally plausible afflictions in his opinion. The open scholarly debate still rippling through history departments today is whether medieval people truly believed these objects worked, or whether belief itself was the point. Was it placebo, faith, or just clever marketing centuries before the first billboard? You think about how not much has changed. Modern wellness influencers, medieval apothecaries. It's a straight evolutionary line. Both promise safety in a world that refuses to stop being dangerous. As the market winds down, rain begins to fall. Soft but persistent, and merchants throw tarps over their goods. The sound of water drumming on canvas mingles with laughter and the lowing of cattle nearby. You duck beneath a wooden awning beside an old apothecary's cart. He's sorting his wares. Bundles of herbs, vials of colored liquid, a bowl of toadstones gleaming like wet marbles. He looks up at you, eyes bright, and says, "They're alive, you know. That's why they work." You nod politely, unsure whether to correct him or let the moment live. He continues, explaining that each stone houses a slumbering spirit, a tiny guardian that feeds on venom and sin alike. You realize he's not trying to trick you. He's trying to make sense of a cruel world with the tools available to him, hope and imagination, a memory from earlier flickers through your mind. The witch bottles buried under the moonlight, and you sense how these myths connect like chapters in a single book of survival. When medicine fails, when justice wobbles, when the night stretches too long, the mind reaches for magic. In that sense, the toadstone isn't so different from a saint's relic or a prayer. You watch the apothecary pack his cart, hands trembling slightly with age, and you feel an odd tenderness for the man and his faith in fossils. He reminds you that every generation invents its own comfort, disguised as certainty. The rain deepens, the streets shimmer, and you walk toward the edge of town where the road dissolves into green fields. Along the way, you notice small charms nailed to doorposts, tiny stones embedded in wood, some of them unmistakably toadstones. They've become part of the architecture now, permanent fixtures of protection. You think of the cathedrals again, of their giants and angels carved from stone, and realize this is the same instinct scaled down. Whether it's a cathedral or a pebble, people need to believe something solid stands between them and chaos. Lightning flickers over the hills, and thunder rolls softly, more sigh than roar. You stop to look at a puddle where raindrops ripple outwards, and for a brief second your reflection merges with the cloudy sky above. You think about how fragile life was here. Disease, famine, war, and how courage sometimes took the shape of superstition. A toadstone on a chain, a charm in a pocket, a prayer whispered into mud. Maybe that was enough to keep despair at bay. You reach a crossroads marked by an ancient stone cross, its surface pitted and worn smooth by centuries of hands tracing its outline. Someone has wedged a toadstone into a crack near the base, a tiny fossil holding vigil. You touch it lightly. It's cold, slick, unremarkable, and yet somehow it feels alive, buzzing faintly with the residue of 1,000 desperate hopes. You realize that belief, when repeated often enough, can leave fingerprints on reality. The stone might not ward off poison, but it carries the weight of every wish that it would. The rain stops, and the clouds thin just enough to let a beam of sunlight spill across the landscape. You watch it glint off puddles, rooftops, and the occasional jewel in a merchant's forgotten tray. Somewhere behind you, a church bell tolls the hour, and the sound rolls over the countryside like a benediction. You breathe in the scent of wet earth and think about how myths are less about ignorance than endurance. The toadstone, ridiculous as it seems, was never just a superstition. It was a portable cathedral, a belief you could hold between two fingers and call protection. You smile to yourself as you continue walking, imagining how future historians might laugh at our own talismans. Lucky bracelets, essential oils, self-help mantras, all the tiny ways we try to trick the void into liking us. The past isn't as far behind as it looks, it's just buried under a thin layer of irony. The path ahead glows faintly under the fading light, and somewhere beyond the next hill the sea waits, teeming, rumor says, with monsters that would make even a toadstone tremble. You leave the quiet fields behind and follow the sound of gulls toward the sea, where the horizon blurs like a rumor too large to fit into the human mind. The air stings of salt, and the wind smells faintly of iron and rotting kelp, a scent both alive and ancient. Here, on the coast, medieval maps stopped making sense. The known world ended somewhere beyond the foam, and imagination began. Sailors gathered in smoky taverns and told tales that made even priests shiver, of oceans that boiled, of serpents as long as villages, of islands that turned out to be sleeping whales. You find yourself among them now, seated on a rough wooden bench, the table sticky with spilled ale, listening as the oldest of the group traces lines in the condensation of his mug. "There," he says, stabbing a finger toward nothing. "That's where the sea breathes fire." The others nod as if he's quoting scripture. To them, the ocean is not a frontier, it's a creature, vast, unpredictable, and occasionally hungry. The mainstream historical fact tucked behind these stories is that many of the so-called sea monster sightings came from real observations: giant squids tangled in fishing nets, whales breaching in fog, volcanic vents sending steam up through the waves. The trouble is that medieval sailors didn't have marine biology textbooks or weather reports. They had imagination, and imagination has better special effects. Maps from this era, like the famous Carta Marina of Olaus Magnus, are crowded with artistic panic. Scaly serpents gnawing ships, lobsters large enough to crush masts, and islands shaped suspiciously like fish with dorsal fins. The quirky tidbit that still makes historians chuckle is that these drawings often served political or moral purposes. One sea monster in the North Atlantic was meant to symbolize Protestant rebellion. Another represented divine wrath against greedy merchants. Geography, theology, and propaganda shared the same parchment. As you walk along the rocky shore, the sea growls against the cliffs like an old storyteller clearing its throat. A wrecked ship lists in the shallows, its timbers creaking as though the ocean hasn't finished chewing. You crouch near a fisherman repairing his net and ask what he's afraid of out there. He shrugs. "The deep," he says simply. "Not monsters, not storms, just the deep itself." It's a perfect medieval answer, equal parts faith and fear. You watch him thread the rope through his fingers, every knot a prayer disguised as work. Somewhere offshore, a dark shape breaks the surface, vanishes, and leaves a single wide ripple. No one gasps. They just cross themselves and keep mending. In this world, mystery isn't a question, it's a neighbor. You think about how every age personalizes its fears. For the medieval mind, the sea was where God filed his unfinished business. It was said that Leviathan slept there, the first and last creature, waiting for the trumpet of Judgment Day to rise and swallow the sun. Mariners swore they saw its spine glinting under moonlight, mistaking waves for scales. Scholars later debated whether Leviathan was literal or metaphorical, though one monk neatly sidestepped the issue by writing both. That line, you realize, could summarize half of human history. Both. The sea is both danger and wonder, punishment and promise. The open scholarly debate that still ripples through universities today is whether people truly believed in literal sea monsters or whether the drawings were more symbolic than sincere. Some historians argue they were metaphors for sin, temptation, and the unknown, the ocean as a mirror of the human soul. Others point to sailor logs filled with eyewitness detail too vivid to dismiss it entirely. Creatures with eyes like moons, mouths that steamed, songs that lured ships onto reefs. Perhaps, like all good myths, they began as misunderstandings and matured into metaphors. The tide creeps closer, licking your boots, and you imagine what it must have been like to set sail back then. No compasses, no certainty, just faith that the world wouldn't swallow you whole. You picture a young deckhand clutching his toadstone amulet from the last chapter, whispering to the saints of the sea. Each time the ship tilted, someone probably crossed themselves, not from superstition but from habit. Fear is easier to bear when ritual gives it choreography. Above them, gulls circle, laughing like skeptics. Below, the abyss hums with possibility. You climb a ridge overlooking the harbor. In the distance, fishermen haul in their catch, silver flashes of herring and, occasionally, something stranger. A long eel-like corpse stretches across the sand, its skin torn and shimmering green. The villagers gather around it, whispering about dragons of the deep, about omens of plague or war. You lean in closer and realize it's just a basking shark, its body warped by decay into legend's shape. But you don't tell them. Maybe you shouldn't. The story will travel faster than reason anyway, and maybe it deserves to. In a world of famine and faith, wonder was nourishment too. As dusk thickens, the horizon ignites with colors no artist could capture. Wine, rust, smoke, and gold. You stand there watching waves erase footprints, feeling the enormity of time in every gust. Once this sea terrified humanity. Now, it terrifies only historians trying to catalog its metaphors. Still, you understand the old fear. Staring into that endless gray expanse, you feel it too. The tug of the unknown. The ancient pulse that whispers, "Don't look too long." The surface ripples again. A patch of light dancing like a living thing. You smile, half expecting a fin to rise, and for a heartbeat you almost wish it would, because somewhere inside, part of you misses a world where mystery was visible, where the sea was alive with creatures that didn't care if you believed in them or not. You turn to leave as the tide rolls in, dragging seaweed and foam around your boots. Behind you the waves crash once louder than before. Deliberate, almost conversational. You pause, listening. The ocean exhales salt and myth, and for the briefest instant you imagine a voice rising from beneath, deep, slow, tired, and amused. Maybe it's only the wind through a hollow shell. Maybe it's Leviathan clearing its throat, waiting for another generation to misinterpret its sighs. You whisper goodnight to the water, and the foam hisses back agreement or warning. It's hard to tell. The last light fades from the surface, and the great dark folds over the sea once more, heavy with the dreams of those who still believe there's something breathing out there, just under the waves. You wake to the tolling of bells from a coastal monastery, their low bronze hum blending with the cries of gulls. The sea fog curls inland like a gray shawl, and through it you glimpse pilgrims climbing a muddy hill toward a shrine built from stone the color of candle wax. Every few steps, someone stops to pray before a glass coffin gleaming beneath the chapel's open doors. Inside lies the preserved body of a saint, or at least what everyone swears is one. You join the procession, feeling the slow, reverent rhythm of feet moving as one. The air is thick with beeswax and incense, but also something fainter, salt, old wood, and the unmistakable sweetness of decay. In the medieval world, the incorrupt body was the ultimate miracle, proof that holiness could outwit time itself. And here you are, standing in front of a face that looks more like wax than flesh, yet still inspires awe. The mainstream historical fact behind this soft glow of faith is that so-called incorrupt saints were often the products of natural mummification, burials in dry, cool soil that slowed decomposition. But for the faithful, science was beside the point. The story mattered more than the process. Pilgrims traveled hundreds of miles just to glimpse a finger bone or lock of hair, convinced that proximity to sanctity could cure disease or forgive sin. In the flicker of torchlight, belief became visible. Someone whispers that the saint once spoke to a shepherd in his dreams, warning of famine. Another insists her eyes follow the devout. A merchant kneels and presses his forehead to the glass, his lips trembling as he promises to donate half his profits if his wife recovers from illness. You realize that for people with little control over life or death, this glass coffin was a negotiation desk with eternity. The quirky tidbit that always seems to get buried in footnotes is that not all holy bodies were quite as advertised. In several cathedrals, inspectors centuries later discovered that some relics were made of wax or stitched together from multiple corpses, a kind of spiritual collage. One abbot even replaced missing bones with wood, carefully painting them ivory so no pilgrim would doubt fraud. Maybe. But perhaps it was a different kind of faith, the belief that symbols could keep miracles alive when nature refused to cooperate. After all, a relic didn't need to work. It just needed to exist long enough for someone to hope. The open scholarly debate still haunting this subject asks whether medieval people truly believed these bodies never decayed, or whether the incorruptibility was a metaphor for divine approval. Some historians argue it was willful imagination, a community deciding together to ignore rot in favor of reverence. Others see it as emotional necessity, a world surrounded by death clinging to the rare illusion of permanence. You look closer at the saint's hands, folded perfectly still, and wonder how many tears have fallen onto that glass, how many prayers condensed into fog. Faith, you realize, is also a kind of preservation, what memory does when it doesn't want to let go. The pilgrims begin to leave offerings, ribbons, bread, coins, and handwritten notes tucked beneath candles. A boy presses a feather against the saint's cheek and gasps when it clings, static mistaken for a miracle. The crowd murmurs approval. Outside, the bell rings again, and sunlight pierces through the fog, illuminating motes of dust that look just for a second like souls rising. You follow the group down to the courtyard, where monks sell small vials of holy oil and fragments of cloth said to have touched the saint's robe. The irony, you can't help but think, is that relics became medieval Europe's first franchise business, each cathedral competing for pilgrims, each miracle monetized. But you don't judge them. Every age turns its faith into currency. The denominations just change. As you leave the shrine, a woman stops you and asks if you felt anything: warmth, a pulse, a sign. You almost say no, but hesitate. There was something there, wasn't there? Not divine, maybe, but deeply human. The heat of collective belief pressing against the walls until even stone seems to breathe. You tell her yes, softly, and her smile widens like dawn. She walks away lighter, and so do you. You take the coastal road again, the chapel shrinking behind you, bells fading into the wind. The fog thins, revealing cliffs where gulls wheel and cry, and for a moment the world feels freshly washed. You think about how saints once replaced the old gods, how their shrines became the new Olympus, and how humans, no matter the century, crave evidence that something pure survives the rot. The sea below flashes silver, waves crash against the rocks like applause. Perhaps that's why the myths never die. They're not lies but longings, sculpted into stories because reality refuses to listen otherwise. You stop once more and glance back. The chapel's windows glint faintly in the distance, as if winking at you across time. You breathe in salt and incense and realize that somewhere, beneath all the superstition and spectacle, faith and decay share a single pulse. Both are proof that humans never stop trying to outlast themselves. Then you turn inland, toward the smell of metal and fire, where rumor says alchemists are busy convincing kings they can turn lead into gold. The road inland narrows between thickets of oak and hawthorn, until it opens onto a field of tents shimmering with heat, their sides painted in alchemical symbols, circles within triangles, serpents swallowing their tails, suns blooming inside flasks. Here lies the true laboratory of dreams, where smoke and ambition mix in equal measure. You step closer, drawn by the low hum of bellows and the clinking of glass, and peek inside a tent glowing red from the forge. The air smells of sulfur, vinegar, and ambition. A man in a soot-streaked robe adjusts a copper alembic, muttering to himself about transmutation, while another carefully pours mercury from a vial, as if it were molten gold. This, you realize, is the heartbeat of the medieval imagination, alchemy, the art that promised to turn not just metal into gold, but human frailty into perfection. The mainstream historical fact is that alchemy wasn't merely mystical nonsense, it was the ancestor of modern chemistry. Figures like Albertus Magnus and Roger Bacon experimented earnestly with distillation, acids, and alloys, unknowingly laying groundwork for laboratories centuries later. But the alchemists themselves believed they were decoding divine handwriting. Each flask, each explosion was a sentence in God's secret language. You watch one scholar carefully stir a solution that hisses softly and turns blue. His face glows with awe. "It lives," he whispers, as if the color itself proves revelation. Nearby, a young apprentice takes frantic notes in Latin, describing vapors as spirits and metals as souls. To them, matter was never inert. It dreamed. The quirky tidbit that never fails to fascinate is that some alchemists truly believed the philosopher's stone, the legendary catalyst that could grant immortality, already existed, hidden in nature, awaiting the right combination of purity and patience. A few claim to have seen it, a glowing red powder or crystal that pulsed like a heartbeat. In Prague, one nobleman spent an entire fortune funding experiments to find it, accidentally inventing better glass instead. Across Europe, kings hired alchemists as both scientists and sorcerers, their success measured less by results than by how long they could delay admitting failure. The dream of gold was addictive, shimmering just out of reach like sunlight through stained glass. And yet, for all their secrecy, alchemists weren't pure charlatans. Many sincerely sought transformation, spiritual as much as material. The open scholarly debate that still circles their legacy is whether they were mystics cloaked in science or scientists cloaked in mysticism. Some modern historians see alchemy as metaphor, an inward quest for purification disguised as metallurgy. Others argue they were genuine experimenters, bound by the limits of their time. Perhaps they were both. The tent around you hisses with the heat of argument. One man quotes scripture, another quotes Aristotle, and a third insists that an angel dictated his last formula in a dream. You almost expect the air itself to shimmer with revelation. Suddenly, a thin metallic pop echoes through the camp, followed by a hiss of smoke. Someone has mixed the wrong elements again. Alchemists rush to smother the flame with sand, coughing but laughing. Failure, you realize, was their daily bread, and still they believed. You watch a woman in the corner grinding powder with a pestle, her motions precise and rhythmic. She looks up briefly, eyes fierce beneath soot. Perfection, she says, comes only through fire. You think about that as smoke coils toward the stars. The hours pass in flickering gold and shadow. As night deepens, the tents become lanterns scattered across the dark, each glowing with its own small miracle. One alchemist claims he's succeeded tonight. He holds up a lump of metal shining faintly in the torchlight. The crowd gathers, breath held. When the light hits it just right, it looks like gold, but the illusion fades when he drops it. Lead again. No one mocks him. Instead, they murmur blessings and return to their furnaces, convinced that next time, next night, they'll find the secret. There's a strange holiness in their persistence. You step outside, the cool air brushing away the heat of the forges. Overhead, the moon hangs pale and watchful. You think back to the villagers who blamed that same moon for madness and magic. Here, too, it rains, etched into the alchemist's diagrams as a symbol of transformation. The wind carries faint voices, prayers, formulas, laughter. These people live on the border between science and spellcraft, between desperation and discovery, and somehow you find yourself admiring them. For all their smoke and failure, they dared to believe the universe could be reasoned with, persuaded to give up its secrets. That's not foolishness, it's courage wrapped in metaphor. Before leaving, you wander into a smaller tent on the edge of the camp. Inside, shelves sag beneath glass jars filled with shimmering liquids. A note on one reads, "For the renewal of spirit, apply during despair." Another says simply, "Light caught sleeping." You smile, half art, half madness, fully human. The apprentice from earlier catches your eye. "You think we're fools," he says quietly. You shake your head. "No," you reply, "just hopeful." He grins and goes back to stirring something that probably shouldn't be stirred. As you walk away, the first light of dawn creeps over the hills. Behind you, the alchemist's fires fade, but their smoke lingers in the sky like handwriting, proof that humanity has always tried to turn confusion into meaning, base matter into beauty. You glance back once more, and for a heartbeat, one of the tents glows brighter than the rest, a crimson pulse that looks almost alive. Maybe it's the sun catching metal. Maybe it's something else. Either way, you smile. Because even if gold never came from lead, hope did, and that's a form of transmutation the alchemists would have understood perfectly. You leave the alchemists behind and wander down a narrow track that smells of loam and damp roots, a reminder that even miracles begin in the dirt. The forest thickens until the trees close in like columns of an old cathedral, their canopies blotting out the sun. Here, the air hums with stories older than science and stranger than faith, stories about a plant that screams when pulled from the ground. The mandrake. Every apothecary in Europe swore it was real. Every herbalist claimed to have seen one, and every peasant knew better than to dig it up without proper precautions. You kneel beside a patch of dark soil and imagine what they believed, that the mandrake was half plant, half person, its pale roots shaped like a tiny human body, its cry so shrill it could kill the digger outright. The mainstream historical fact behind this feverish fear is that the mandrake root, Mandragora officinarum, does exist. Its twisted shape and narcotic properties made it both medicinal and terrifying. Medieval physicians used it as a sedative for surgeries long before anesthesia, and when overused it caused hallucinations vivid enough to be mistaken for encounters with spirits. But myth and medicine rarely stay separate for long. Soon, people began writing manuals on how to harvest it safely. You had to dig around the root at midnight, tie a hungry black dog to its stem, plug your ears with wax, and then run away while the dog did the dirty work. When it yanked the plant free, the mandrake would scream, and the dog would drop dead, proof, supposedly, that the danger was real. Somewhere in the chaos of superstition, the poor animal's loyalty became a footnote to pharmacology. The quirky tidbit that would fit right into a dark comedy is that the screaming was often staged. Vendors at markets sold fake mandrakes carved from parsnips or ginseng, baked in the sun until they hardened into grotesque little figures, then swaddled in silk and perfumed with frankincense. They claimed each root had a gender. Male roots for virility, female roots for fertility, and priced them accordingly. Some collectors even gave theirs names and tucked them into bed at night, convinced they whispered prophecies in their sleep. In wealthy households, mandrakes were passed down like family relics, their shriveled limbs wrapped in lace, and their alleged power renewed with milk or wine offerings. It's easy to laugh now, but you suspect that somewhere in that ritual feeding a plant, fearing its voice, was a primitive tenderness, a wish for the world to be more alive than it seems. The open scholarly debate that survives today isn't about whether people believed in the mandrake, they clearly did, but why. Some historians argue it was an early attempt to personify nature, a way of granting dignity to the living earth. Others suggest it was born of guilt, the idea that uprooting anything sacred must carry a price. Either way, it made botany feel personal. You picture a herbalist standing in candlelight, grinding mandrake root into powder while whispering an apology. Maybe every superstition begins that way, not with ignorance but with awe. You step deeper into the forest. The earth squelches beneath your boots, and the smell of damp moss fills your lungs. Somewhere nearby, water trickles over stone, a sound that almost masks a faint, eerie whimper. You freeze. It's probably the wind or an animal, but for a moment your imagination betrays you. You half expect to see a pale root-shaped figure twisting from the soil, mouth open in silent protest. The forest suddenly feels less like a place and more like a pulse. You understand now why people filled these woods with warnings. Knowledge without wonder is just noise, and the Middle Ages, for all their superstition, never forgot how to listen. You find a fallen log and sit for a while, letting the silence settle. The forest smells rich and alive, and the light filtering through the leaves is the same light that once fell on terrified herbalists and hopeful fraudsters alike. You think of the alchemists, hammering at the secrets of metals, and realize that these root diggers were doing the same, trying to turn fear into understanding. One with fire, one with soil, both convinced that truth hides in plain sight. As twilight begins to seep through the branches, you stand and brush the dirt from your hands. You spot a cluster of white flowers ahead, their petals trembling faintly in the wind, and you can't help but smile. Maybe it's just the breeze. Or maybe, as medieval folk believed, plants really do sigh when humans get too close. You whisper a small apology, just in case, and the air around you softens, as if the forest itself forgives you. When you step back onto the path, the world feels a little stranger, a little kinder, and infinitely more alive. You leave the forest, and find yourself walking toward a meadow where the grass glows pale in the moonlight, whispering against your boots as though gossiping about what you've seen. A soft mist coils around the ground, and somewhere far off you hear the distant laughter of children, or perhaps something pretending to be children. This is the borderland between the human and the hidden, a place medieval people approached with both reverence and terror. Here, fairies aren't the delicate, glittering sprites of picture books, but cunning, unpredictable beings, some benevolent, most not. They live beside you, but just out of sight, their moods as changeable as the weather. In the Middle Ages, every forest clearing, every sudden gust of wind, every lost shoe could be traced back to them. You've stepped into the realm of fairies, changelings, and stolen children, where myth and grief often shared the same cradle. The mainstream historical fact is that belief in fairies was nearly universal across medieval Europe, not as childish fantasy but as a practical explanation for the inexplicable illness, infertility, or sudden disappearance. Before germ theory or genetics, people needed logic that could sing. So when a baby sickened overnight or a cow refused to give milk, the cause was rarely bad luck. It was fairy mischief. The changeling myth, particularly, gave people a strange kind of comfort. The idea that an ailing or strange child wasn't their real one, but a fairy substitute left behind by the hidden folk. The real baby, they said, was being pampered in some otherworldly meadow, safe and beautiful. Cruel in hindsight, yes, but it softened unbearable grief. Parents would perform small rituals, leaving bread and milk by the door, hanging iron scissors above the crib, whispering prayers over sleeping faces, each act a shield woven from desperation. The quirky tidbit that makes you smile and shiver at once is that in some places people tried to trick the fairies into revealing themselves. One method involved boiling eggshells over a fire while chanting nonsense verses. If the baby suddenly laughed or spoke like an adult, it was proof of enchantment. Another involved placing the supposed changeling on a shovel and holding it briefly over the fire to scare the fairies into swapping the real child back. Horrifying to imagine now, but back then it wasn't cruelty, it was medicine for the soul. In a world with no doctors for despair, myth was therapy, however clumsy. Even educated clergy tolerated these customs, quietly acknowledging that faith and folklore often shared the same parish. The open scholarly debate still flickering through academic journals today asks whether changeling myths were merely cultural scapegoats for tragedy or whether they represented something deeper, a collective recognition of difference long before psychology existed. Some historians suggest that children with developmental disorders were labeled as fairy-touched, not out of malice but confusion. Others see the changeling as metaphor, the fear that love itself could be stolen, replaced by something that looks the same but feels wrong. You think about that as the mist curls tighter around your ankles, and you can almost sense a presence watching from the tree line. Curious, not hostile like the forest itself holding its breath. In the meadow ahead, faint lights flicker, will-o'-the-wisps dancing low over the reeds. You walk closer, and the air cools sharply, smelling of rain and wet iron. The lights dart away, teasing. In another age, you'd have called them fairies too, or souls of the unbaptized, or spirits of lost travelers. The line between ghost and fae was thin as cobweb. A shepherd once told a monk that he saw a procession of fairies marching through his fields at midnight, carrying torches and singing in a language older than sin. The monk recorded it as evidence of demons. The shepherd just called it neighbors passing through. The Middle Ages didn't divide the world into real and unreal. It divided it into visible and hidden, and the hidden was always busier. You sit on a mossy stone near a brook, listening to the trickle of water. The moon ripples in the current like an eye blinking slowly. You remember how, earlier, villagers buried witch bottles and trusted the moon to guard their sleep. Here, the logic is the same. Appease the unseen, and maybe it'll leave you in peace. You notice offerings tucked between roots, crumbs of bread, a braid of hair, a single coin blackened by age. Someone, recently or centuries ago, thought this was the right place to bargain with wonder. You reach out and touch the coin. It's cold, heavy, utterly human, and suddenly you feel how thin the wall is between story and survival. A sudden breeze lifts the mist, revealing small shapes in the distance, perhaps just rocks, though one of them moves like it's stretching. You freeze. Then laughter, soft and musical, ripples through the grass before vanishing as quickly as it came. You exhale, half smiling. Maybe imagination's the price of walking too close to history. Or maybe some myths are patient, waiting centuries for another audience. You stand and dust off your cloak, feeling the grass sway against your legs like invisible fingers saying goodbye. As you leave the meadow, the sound of water fades behind you, replaced by distant church bells and the far-off cry of something neither bird nor beast. The road curves back toward the villages, where humanity tries to domesticate wonder behind wooden walls. You look up once more at the stars, still bright, still unmoved by our little fears, and you realize that every myth from dragons to fairies begins as a question whispered to the dark. What's out there when no one's looking? The answer, then, as now, is simple. Everything. By the time you return to the village road, the air has changed. It's thicker now, damp with the smell of iron, sweat, and something faintly metallic that stings the back of your throat. You follow the sound of clinking basins and the low murmur of voices until you reach a timbered building with a painted sign swinging outside. A bowl, a drop of blood, and a cross. You found the surgeon barber, and inside the floorboards tremble with the business of bloodletting and balancing humors. the medieval cure for nearly everything except common sense. You push open the door and step into a world where medicine hums with ritual precision, where healing feels as much like sorcery as science. The barber greets you with a grin too wide for comfort, his apron stained pink from today's patients. On the table beside him, a line of pewter cups glistens like trophies. He gestures for you to sit, already guessing your ailment. Headache, melancholy, perhaps too much thinking. In the Middle Ages, health wasn't a mystery but a balance, and the body was a vessel filled with 4 sacred fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. These were not mere substances, they were your temperament, your mood, your very essence. Too much blood, you were passionate and rash. Too little, weak and cold-hearted. The mainstream historical fact is that this theory, inherited from ancient Greek medicine and refined by Galen, dominated European thought for over 1,000 years. It shaped every prescription, every diet, every doctor's shrug. You watch as the barber unwraps a leech from a small glass jar, its body twitching with eager life. This one, he says proudly, prefers noble blood. You suspect it's salesmanship, but you hold out your arm anyway, because saying no feels like tempting fate. The creature latches on with surprising gentleness, and soon you feel a slow pull, a strange rhythmic sip that makes your skin crawl and your curiosity bloom. Around you, other patients sit in silence, staring at the floor as if humility itself is part of the treatment. On the far wall, an anatomy chart shows a cheerful man leaking from various parts of his body, each labeled with its preferred cure. For fever, cut the right arm; for melancholy, open the ankle; for heartbreak, well, pray harder. The quirky tidbit, hidden in all this gore and geometry, is that medieval doctors actually believed each season, food, and even color could shift your humors. In spring, blood reigned, so bleeding was fashionable. In winter, phlegm dominated, making hot soup practically divine medicine. Some physicians prescribed roasted hedgehog for rheumatism and wine boiled with emerald dust for courage, proof that desperation breeds creativity. In one monastery, a particularly ambitious monk attempted to balance the entire community's humors by assigning specific meals to match their moods. Chronic worriers got spicy mustard. Lazy souls were fed bitter herbs. He recorded the results with scientific optimism. All seemed cured for several hours. You can't help but grin. Humanity, it seems, has always mistaken temporary distraction for progress. The open scholarly debate among historians today isn't whether people believed this system; they did, but whether it truly comforted them or merely gave structure to suffering. Some scholars argue that humorism offered psychological relief, turning chaos into chartable order. Others say it dulled curiosity, trapping medicine in metaphor for centuries. Either way, it gave meaning to pain, and in a world short on explanations, that was half the cure. You glance again at the leech, now bloated and content, and realize how much of medicine then, and maybe still, is faith disguised as routine. The barber removes the leech with a flourish and drops it into a wooden bowl, where it writhes briefly before settling. Your complexion will brighten by morning, he says, wiping your arm with linen. You nod, unsure whether you feel lighter from blood loss or belief. In the corner, a priest blesses a jar of vinegar while a midwife consults a chart of stars to determine the ideal moment for childbirth. Science and superstition share the same room here, neither offended by the other's presence. It's strangely harmonious, almost comforting. You step outside into the afternoon light, feeling slightly dizzy but oddly peaceful. The village hums around you. Vendors shouting, chickens scattering, the world carrying on as if nothing about its theories of health has ever been absurd. You pass a well where a woman mixes herbs into a jug of water, whispering a prayer that smells of time and desperation. Her husband, pale and sweating, sips obediently. In a way, you envy them. There's something beautiful in believing that balance can be restored with a few drops of blood and a steady hand. As you walk on, you notice a crimson trail leading toward the river, discarded leeches crawling lazily through the mud, survivors of another day's healing. You watch one for a moment, marveling at its persistence. In another century, it will be replaced by syringes and stethoscopes, but for now, it's a doctor's best friend and a patient's reluctant hope. You find yourself wondering whether future generations will look back at our own cures, our pills, our screens, our habits, and laugh the same way. Probably, progress always looks foolish in hindsight. The wind shifts, carrying the scent of iron downstream, and you realize you're walking toward the village chapel again, its bell faint but steady. Somewhere inside, someone's probably praying for a recovery medicine can't deliver. You tighten your cloak, feeling the faint tug of the bandage on your arm, and think that maybe the real balance medieval people sought wasn't of humors but of heart, a way to reconcile fear and faith without bleeding too much of either. You glance at the horizon where smoke from the forges curls into the clouds, and you walk toward it, drawn by the strange comfort of human persistence, the need to keep trying even when the world makes no sense at all. You follow the stream of people moving toward a small chapel built from timber and white plaster, its windows round and narrow like watchful eyes. The air here smells of candle smoke and rosemary, sharp and sweet at once. Inside, someone is crying softly, one hand pressed to a swollen cheek. You realize you've walked straight into one of the most dreaded corners of medieval medicine, toothache and the demons that caused it. The crowd parts for a man in a dark robe, holding a set of iron tongs that glint like tiny swords in the light of the torches. You brace yourself, not for the pain of dentistry, but for the spectacle of belief. In this age, pain is never just physical. It's moral, spiritual, maybe even contagious. The mainstream historical fact hiding beneath this smoky theater is that medieval dentistry barely existed as a profession. Barbers, blacksmiths, and surgeons all competed for the title of tooth drawer. An infected tooth was a battle between decay and superstition. People believed that the agony inside the gums came from small worms sent by demons or born of sin, burrowing into the enamel like punishment with a schedule. Physicians even printed pamphlets describing these worms in loving detail, curled, pale, malicious little things that ate the tooth from the inside until the soul confessed. In some versions, they were visible if you held a mirror to your mouth under moonlight. Unsurprisingly, no one enjoyed that experiment twice. The quirky tidbit, the kind that would make a modern dentist choke on laughter, is that some medieval healers claimed to draw out these worms by smoking the mouth with henbane or pepper over a small fire. The patient would lean over a steaming bowl while a chant was recited, half prayer, half recipe. As the gums numbed and throbbed, tiny strings of cooked tissue would appear, which the healer triumphantly displayed as proof that the worms had fled. People cheered. The healer got paid. Pain, temporarily relieved by the herb's narcotic fumes, felt like divine deliverance. Everyone went home convinced that demons, once again, had been negotiated with rather than diagnosed. The open scholarly debate among historians today asks whether people truly saw these treatments as exorcisms or simply folded spiritual language into everyday medicine. Some suggest that dental demons were never literal, just the church's way of explaining invisible pain. Others argue that belief was more flexible, that a person could trust both the herbs and the prayers at once. You consider how modern medicine still uses faith in different packaging: sterile rooms, confident voices, the reassurance that this will only sting a little. Maybe the rituals haven't changed, only their vocabulary. The man with the iron tongs wipes his brow, calls for wine, and begins his work. The woman in the chair grips a wooden cross, whispering the Lord's Prayer through gritted teeth. The crowd murmurs blessings as the tooth finally comes free, a small victory of noise and relief. The healer drops it into a basin filled with vinegar, mutters a few words in Latin, and because nothing is wasted, uses it to diagnose the demon responsible. A prideful one, he declares solemnly, for it held on too tightly. The crowd nods in agreement. Pain, once again, has been given a name, and therefore feels less infinite. You step outside into the night, gulping the fresh air as though rinsing your own mouth. The smell of wine and sweat follows you, mingling with the faint metallic scent of blood. Somewhere nearby, a child plays with a small pouch, one of the many tooth amulets sold outside chapels. These tiny charms made from herbs and bits of silver are supposed to prevent toothaches and jealousy alike. He shakes it proudly, certain it works because his mother says so. You remember the witch bottles, the toadstones, the lunar charms, and now this, another link in humanity's endless chain of bargaining. The moon rises higher, casting silver light over the muddy street. A man passes you with a scarf tied around his jaw, mumbling about devils in his molars. He's heading toward the healer's fire, carrying his pain like a confession. You realize the real miracle isn't that people believed in demons, but that they faced pain with ritual instead of despair. For all the blood and smoke, these crude ceremonies turned suffering into ceremony, something shared, even sacred. And you think of how, in every age, people still gather in waiting rooms and clinics, clutching hope like a talisman, whispering their own small prayers to science or chance or mercy. The tools change, but the longing doesn't. As you walk away from the chapel, the faint sound of laughter drifts after you, someone relieved, someone healed, someone hopeful enough to keep believing that the ache in the body can be coaxed out by human hands. The night deepens, but it feels a little less dark for having seen it. That fragile, absurd faith that maybe, just maybe, pain listens when you name it. By dawn, the village feels half asleep and half expectant. The kind of quiet that follows rain or confession. You walk toward the church square, where townsfolk stand pointing at the sky. Everyone's faces glow with the same uneasy awe. Above them hangs a streak of light, a comet, bright enough to turn shadows blue against the walls. In the medieval world, that silver scratch across the heavens is never just pretty. It's a memo from God's desk, written in fire. Mothers clutch their children, priests murmur prayers, and a tanner swears he smells brimstone. A scribe somewhere will write that this is a harbinger of war, plague, or royal death, while another will claim it marks the birth of a saint. You stare upward, realizing that you're looking at one of the few shared fears that stretched across continents, the idea that the sky itself could frown. The mainstream historical fact is that medieval chronicles meticulously recorded every comet they saw. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle mentioned one in 1066, the same year William crossed the Channel, and forever after that glowing arc was known as an omen of invasion. Astronomers in Baghdad, however, already suspected that comets were natural, perhaps vaporous clouds illuminated by sunlight, though they admitted the timing was suspiciously theatrical. It would take centuries before anyone dared say aloud and safely that these streaks had nothing to do with divine emotion. Until then, every appearance of a comet sent Europe into poetic panic. The quirky tidbit buried in this glittering superstition is that some towns literally tried to fight comets. In parts of Germany and France, people rang bells, fired cannons, or even shot flaming arrows into the night, hoping to scare the thing away before it dripped disaster. Others took a gentler approach, singing hymns, lighting candles, or fasting for days, because what better way to reason with heaven than with empty stomachs? You can imagine it, 1,000 voices chanting beneath the cold tail of light, begging the sky to blink elsewhere. A monk once described a comet as a broom in the hand of God, sweeping sinners from the earth, and from then on, every streak carried the smell of cleaning day. The open scholarly debate that lingers now is whether comets truly altered the course of politics or merely reflected fears that were already smoldering. Did kings act rashly because the people panicked, or did the people panic because kings declared they should? Either way, the result was the same: Taxes rose, soldiers marched, and someone somewhere blamed the stars for everything wrong with humanity. You think about how convenient that must have felt, to place responsibility so high above reach that no one could argue with it. Even now, when satellites map every pebble of ice that crosses the void, the habit remains. People still look up for meaning, though today we call it forecasting instead of prophecy. The comet brightens as dawn approaches, its tail stretching like a ghostly river. You watch as villagers kneel in the mud, their faces illuminated by fear and fascination in equal measure. One young woman, her hair loose, lifts her hands and whispers that the world might be ending, but she's smiling, almost relieved. You can't blame her. In a life so uncertain, apocalypse offered closure. A wandering friar uses the moment to preach repentance, waving his arms like a conductor orchestrating hysteria. Coins drop into his basket faster than confessions into a booth. Commerce, you realize, always finds a way to orbit faith. You climb a small hill outside the square where the air smells cleaner and quieter. From here, the comet's tail fades into the pale blue of morning. The birds resume their chorus, unimpressed. You think about how the universe must look from its perspective. Centuries of humans panicking every time it passes, shouting at the sky like ants lecturing a bonfire. It's funny and a little sad. Yet you also feel the pulse of empathy. Those medieval watchers weren't fools, just imaginative realists. When everything on earth felt uncertain, harvests, kings, disease, it made perfect sense to believe the heavens were trying to communicate. Silence, after all, is unbearable. Even a cosmic warning sounds better than indifference. The sun edges higher, dissolving the comet into daylight. The villagers slowly disperse, half relieved, half disappointed that the world still exists. You linger, tasting the faint chill of dawn on your tongue, and wonder what story they'll tell tonight. Probably that the prayers worked, that the comet fled because they were righteous, and maybe that's the most human ending of all. Every disaster we survive becomes proof that belief was right. You smile, turn your back on the brightening sky, and keep walking inland, where whispers say the planets themselves sing a kind of secret music, a harmony only scholars and dreamers claim to hear. The road unwinds toward the edge of a small university town, a place that smells of ink, wet parchment, and possibility. Bells toll from a tower built not for worship but for wonder, and inside the students are arguing again. You wander into a courtyard where clusters of robed scholars gesture wildly with quills, debating whether the planets are silent stones or divine musicians. It's the age of the music of the spheres, when educated men and women genuinely believed that the cosmos was a vast orchestra playing in perfect harmony, and that if you listened hard enough or prayed purely enough, you might hear it. The air itself hums with conviction. One professor lifts his eyes toward the fading comet from the night before and declares, "The heavens are tuned to God's heartbeat." Another, more skeptical, mutters that perhaps it's just the wind. The students, caught between poetry and calculation, take notes as if either could be proven by diagram. The mainstream historical fact behind this celestial symphony is that the idea came from the ancient Greeks, revived and sanctified by medieval scholars like Boethius and later Thomas Aquinas. They taught that the planets moved in mathematically perfect ratios like strings on a lute, creating a harmony too pure for mortal ears. For centuries, astronomy and music were sister sciences. To study one was to glimpse the other. The orbits of Jupiter and Saturn were intervals, the moon a soft bass note, and Earth itself a kind of drum keeping time with human folly. It was beautiful and utterly untestable. Yet you can't help but think it gave people a reason to believe the universe liked order as much as they did. The quirky tidbit that still makes historians smile is that some monks took this concept literally enough to try reproducing it. They built wind organs timed to the movement of sundials, convinced they could mimic the harmony of the heavens. Others claimed that saints occasionally heard the cosmic melody in dreams, returning with eyes that sparkled like stars. A chronicler in Paris wrote that one visionary described it as a music made of light, and ever since, artists have painted halos not just as circles of glory, but as echoes of that eternal song. The overlap between theology and acoustics was a dangerous but dazzling place. The open scholarly debate that survives even now is whether these philosophers actually believed they could measure such sounds, or whether music was simply metaphor, a poetic way to express the divine mathematics they sensed in nature. Some modern scientists argue that they weren't entirely wrong. The vibrations of planetary magnetospheres do create low-frequency tones, inaudible but real. Perhaps the medieval mystics were only off by the tools, not the idea. You imagine how thrilled they'd be to know their impossible melody still resonates, faint and factual, across the vacuum. Inside the hall, a friar scratches equations onto a slate, circles within circles, labeled with Latin and hope. Every note, he says, corresponds to virtue. Sin creates dissonance. You can see why the theory thrived. It turned morality into melody, guilt into sound. The student beside you whispers that when an eclipse happens, it's God striking a wrong chord to remind humanity to tune its souls. You almost laugh, but you don't, because somewhere beneath the quaintness lies something hauntingly beautiful, the belief that harmony, not chaos, was the natural state of creation. You step outside as night falls again, and the first stars begin to pierce the dark. The breeze stirs the trees in rhythmic waves, and for a moment you understand why they thought the heavens sang. The rustle of leaves, the chirp of crickets, even the slow thump of your own heartbeat, weave into a single pattern. Maybe the music isn't above you at all, but around you. Vibration disguised as silence. You think of the medieval students bending over their manuscripts, measuring circles with compasses, trying to hear eternity through geometry. And you envy them a little. Certainty sounds wonderful, especially when it hums. From the chapel nearby, a choir begins a slow chant, their voices layered and pure, climbing in intervals that seem almost mathematical. The sound drifts across the courtyard, merging with the sigh of wind and the faint tolling of the bell tower. You close your eyes, and for a fleeting second it happens. You hear it, or think you do, a tone that stretches beyond the human range, vast and trembling, like the world itself inhaling. Whether it's imagination or something older doesn't matter. The feeling lingers, warm and electric, as though the stars are applauding from a distance. When you open your eyes again, the sky looks unchanged, but you sense rhythm where before there was randomness. The heavens, silent and indifferent, have been remade in your mind as something patient, ordered, almost kind. You smile in the dark, realizing the truth the medieval dreamers never doubted. Maybe the universe has always been singing, we just keep forgetting the tune. You leave the university behind as morning fog slides over the cobblestones, softening the edges of everything, even reason. The road winds toward the forest again, but this time it feels wilder, the trees heavier, the air tense with something older than faith. You pass a wooden cross nailed to an oak, and realize you've stepped into the territory of werewolves, those restless half-human, half-beast figures that haunted Europe's imagination for centuries. In the medieval mind, the forest wasn't just a place of trees. It was the border of civilization's courage, the line between reason and instinct. People feared it, not because of the wolves that lived there, but because of the thought that one of those wolves might once have been their neighbor. The mainstream historical fact beneath the howling legend is that werewolf trials really happened. In parts of France and Germany, men and women were accused of shape-shifting into beasts and executed just as witches were. The most famous case in 16th century France involved a man named Gilles Garnier, whose hunger and perhaps madness led him to kill children. Villagers insisted he did it in wolf form. Even centuries earlier, The church issued edicts condemning such beliefs as pagan, but the stories persisted. The wolf, after all, was the perfect mirror for humanity's darker side, loyal, cunning, merciless when cornered. Medieval Europe couldn't decide whether to admire or annihilate it. The quirky tidbit buried in the fur of these tales is that not all werewolves were villains. Some folk stories speak of cursed knights who became wolves to serve God, prowling the woods to protect travelers. In Brittany, peasants left bread and milk at crossroads for the good wolves, believing they watched over lost souls at night. Even scholars joined the debate. One monk described the transformation scientifically, suggesting the moon's rays caused a vapor in the brain that stirred the blood to animal passions. It's absurd, yes, but also weirdly poetic, a diagnosis halfway between astronomy and poetry. In a world without psychology, turning into a wolf was one way to explain rage, grief, or guilt that wouldn't stay buried. The open scholarly debate among historians today asks why these stories surged when they did. Some link them to outbreaks of rabies, which could make victims howl and bite. Others see them as allegories for the brutality of war and famine. Still others argue the werewolf was a metaphor for class anxiety, the fear that peasants, starving and desperate, might turn on their masters. Whatever the cause, it's clear that the myth served as both warning and confession. The beast outside was really the beast within. You walk deeper into the forest. The branches knit overhead, blotting out the sky until the world feels like a cathedral built of bark and breath. Somewhere nearby, a wolf howls, long, mournful, so real that the hair on your arms rises. You remind yourself that wolves are shy, that they avoid people, that the sound is only an echo. But your body doesn't care about facts. It listens to instincts that haven't evolved since firelight was the only defense. You glance back toward the village, suddenly grateful for walls and windows. A clearing opens ahead, and in its center lies a shrine. Just stones arranged in a rough circle, marked with scratches that might be prayers or warnings. Someone has left offerings, feathers, bones, a few coins blackened with soot. You kneel to inspect one of the stones and see claw marks that look too deliberate to be natural. You can almost picture it. Villagers gathering here on full moon nights, whispering stories about men who forgot their own faces. Maybe one of them even hoped for it. Secretly, freedom from guilt, from taxes, from conscience. To be a wolf was to be innocent in a violent way, answerable only to hunger. A breeze moves through the clearing, carrying the scent of fur and damp leaves. For a heartbeat, the forest seems alive in a way language can't reach. You remember how the monks once wrote that every sin had a shape and every shape a sound. Lust was a low growl, envy a whine, wrath a snarl. You listen, and you swear you hear all three layered in the rustle of branches. The wolf myth, you realize, wasn't a horror story. It was a mirror held up to humanity, a way of asking what happens when civilization runs out of candlelight. You stay until dusk, when the shadows thicken and the forest exhales its first chill. Somewhere far off, another howl echoes. Closer this time, but softer, almost questioning. You feel it more than hear it. In the ribs, the throat, the instinctive ache to answer back. You don't, of course. You're not medieval, you tell yourself. You're not afraid of fairy tales. But as you turn to leave, your reflection catches in a puddle. Just a smear of motion, half light, half dark. And for an instant, the eyes staring back look hungrier than your own. You walk faster, boots striking the path. The night alive with small movements that refuse to declare themselves. When you finally break from the tree line, the village lights glow ahead like distant stars. Human, fragile, reassuring. You pause, hand to your chest, heartbeat loud in your ears. Somewhere behind you the forest sighs and settles, its stories curling back into silence until the next full moon. You breathe out slowly and smile. The werewolves are gone, but the part of you that wanted to believe, That ancient muscle of wonder still lingers, stretching under your skin like something that remembers how to howl. The moon has barely set when you find yourself walking once more toward a dim light on the horizon, an alchemist's tower, or so the villagers whisper. You expect smoke and fire, but the air smells instead of lavender and ink. Inside, the scene feels eerily familiar yet lonelier than the bustling tents you saw before. Shelves sag under glass jars. Pages covered with equations are pinned to the walls, and in the center, an old man stirs a crucible that glows like a dying heart. He doesn't look up when you enter. "You're late," he says, "though you've never met. We almost had it." His voice cracks like parchment. The philosopher's stone, he explains, sits always one failed experiment away. Every alchemist says the same. The mainstream historical fact behind this obsession is that even after the church banned many forms of occult study, alchemy remained tolerated if it claimed to serve divine purpose. The stone wasn't just a myth about making gold, it promised to purify the soul, to turn mortality into perfection. Scholars from England to Prague pursued it with equal parts theology and desperation. You watch as the old man adds a drop of mercury to the mixture. The flame flares green, then blue, then dies. He sighs. It never listens. In that small sentence lies the ache of centuries, humanity arguing with matter. The quirky tidbit that history left us is how easily charlatans and geniuses shared the same lab coat. Some claimed success, selling projection powders that turned base metal golden for exactly one demonstration before collapsing into gray dust. Others fooled kings with elaborate light tricks, coating coins in thin mercury films that gleamed until touched. But just as many truly believed. One alchemist wrote that the stone spoke to him in dreams as a red child made of glass, whispering that he was close. Another, Nicholas Flamel, whose legend later bewitched the Renaissance, became so famous that tourists still visit his supposed house in Paris, convinced he discovered immortality and faked his death. You glance at the old man before you and can't help wondering how much of that rumor he'd trade for one real spark. The open scholarly debate about alchemy still divides historians. Was it merely pre-chemistry wrapped in mysticism, or was it, as Jung later suggested, a coded exploration of the human psyche? Some argue that gold and mercury symbolized the opposing forces of the soul, and the stone represented psychological unity, the impossible balance between instinct and intellect. Others insist that for many practitioners the dream was literal. They really thought they could trap eternity in a bottle. Maybe both are true. Maybe that's what makes the myth eternal. You walk around the workshop, running your fingers along the cracked table. Books lie open everywhere. De Mineralibus, Summa Perfectionis, titles half lost to dust. Every margin is alive with scribbled notes, equations nested inside prayers. The air feels charged, like the moment before thunder. "Why gold?" you ask quietly. The alchemist smiles without looking up. "Because it doesn't rust," he says. "Because it remembers sunlight." You realize then that the stone was never just about wealth. It was about permanence, the fantasy of unspoiled light in a world that decays. Outside, dawn begins to filter through the window, turning the room amber. The alchemist straightens, his eyes red from sleeplessness. "They think we're fools," he mutters, "but tell me who else still believes the world can be perfected." He reaches into the crucible, lifts a small, dull lump, and presses it into your palm. It's warm, unexpectedly heavy, utterly unremarkable. "Not gold," he says, "not yet," but his expression holds the fragile dignity of someone who refuses to stop trying. You leave him there as sunlight spills across the room, igniting tiny sparks in the dust. On your way out, you pass a shelf lined with identical lumps, hundreds of failures or maybe hundreds of steps. You think of the earlier alchemists under their tents, of the cathedrals built by anonymous hands, of the villagers burying witch bottles under the moon. Each one of them was trying, in their own clumsy way, to wrest order from chaos, meaning from matter. The philosopher's stone might be a lie, but it's a beautiful one, a promise that transformation is possible, that what's base can become noble. As you step outside, the air feels sharper, cleaner. You hold the lump in your hand until it cools, then place it gently on the stone wall beside the door. Behind you, the alchemist begins to hum, a low, tuneless sound that could be prayer or fatigue. The smoke from his chimney curls upward into the pale morning, drawing a thin gray line between heaven and the stubborn, glowing earth. And for a moment you understand. The true stone isn't hidden in his furnace, but in the refusal to stop believing that something miraculous still waits inside the next handful of dust. The path from the alchemist's tower winds upward toward a hilltop where workers are erecting a strange unfinished structure, a stone skeleton against the sky. This is not another cathedral, though it borrows the same ambition. Here lies the tale of the Tower of Babel rebuilt, an echo of an ancient story that humanity can once again touch the heavens. Villagers and craftsmen chatter as they haul blocks of limestone, carving each with care and devotion, some whispering that the higher they build, the closer they get to God's ear. Skeptics mutter that the project is folly, that pride will topple stones like dominoes, but most of the laborers keep their eyes on the sky, measuring each layer as if it were a moral test as well as a physical one. The mainstream historical fact is that stories of human ambition reaching heaven persisted through the Middle Ages, embedded in sermons and literature as moral warnings. The original biblical Tower of Babel told of a people whose pride led God to confuse their languages, scattering them across the earth. Medieval builders, inspired by stories and faith, sometimes attempted ambitious towers and spires, reaching heights that dwarfed normal construction. Chroniclers marveled at these structures, often interpreting the builders' motives as moral, theological, or miraculous rather than mere engineering. The blend of caution and awe created a fertile ground for myth-making, turning architectural endeavors into allegorical lessons. A quirky tidbit you notice in the margin of a mason's ledger is that in some villages, workers attempted to coordinate by using song. One chronicler describes them chanting phrases in multiple languages, some real, some invented, believing that harmonizing speech could prevent divine punishment. It was less about logistics than hope, a rhythmic, polyglot spell intended to curry favor with God. Some workers genuinely claimed that the stones aligned themselves better when the chants were precise, though later analysis suggests the illusion came from repetition and careful placement, not mystical forces. You almost laugh imagining a foreman correcting grammar mid-build while the scaffold shakes under the weight of ambition. The open scholarly debate that continues today is whether these architectural myths genuinely influenced construction techniques or merely reflected medieval anxiety about pride and divine oversight. Some historians see the rebuilt Babel as metaphorical, illustrating humanity's enduring fascination with hubris. Others argue that belief in supernatural consequences directly affected the pace, precision, and ceremonial rituals of construction. In any case, the boundary between myth and work was porous. For those raising stone block by stone block, fear and faith were equally tools. You wander closer, noticing that the workers are marking lines on the limestone with chalk and prayer, each etching a silent plea for protection. You imagine a block being lifted into place and the mason whispering, "God grant this corner stands true," hoping for both divine favor and earthly success. Children play nearby, rolling hoops across the dirt, occasionally hiding behind barrels to pretend they are giants or angels, echoing the very stories that inspired the construction. Their laughter ricochets against unfinished walls, blending with the murmur of wind that carries an almost musical tone, as if the universe itself were testing your balance. A carpenter wipes sweat from his brow and mutters that the higher they go, the heavier the punishment if God displeases. A priest nods solemnly, reminding everyone that every word, every stone is observed. Some scholars debate whether this sense of observation created extraordinary precision or paralytic caution. Either way, it added gravity to labor. You crouch to examine a stone, noticing small symbols carved into its base, crosses, stars, and tiny footprints. They're not decoration, they're protective charms, subtle attempts to prevent divine or natural calamity. Every hand that touches these stones contributes to the myth, whether it believes in it or not. The sun dips lower, painting the sky orange and lilac. You notice that some of the workers stop to rest, gazing upward at the stones already in place. The tallest blocks are barely stabilized, yet they shine with promise in the fading light. The Tower of Babel, unfinished or metaphorical, becomes more than a story. It is a practice, a rehearsal for ambition itself. And perhaps that's the point. Myth is the scaffold, faith the mortar, and human effort the load-bearing beam. You step back as the breeze stirs, carrying the scent of wet stone and clay. Somewhere below, the villagers gather for supper, unaware that they are part of a living allegory. The shadow of the tower stretches across the ground, a reminder that human aspiration casts long echoes. You imagine generations coming, seeing the structure, and interpreting it as either hubris or heroism, proof that myth and labor are forever intertwined. The wind whistles through the half-built arches, and for a heartbeat, you hear what might be angels sighing or simply the echoes of human dreams. The sun finally touches the horizon, and the tower glows like a promise that ambition, however flawed, leaves a mark on time. The road winds down from the hill, past the shadow of the unfinished tower, and brings you back toward the village square where a curious sight awaits. A small courtroom, timbered and open to the air, filled with townsfolk murmuring and children peeking from behind barrels. Today, they are here for animals on trial, a practice that seems absurd now, but was once a serious matter. A pig stands tethered in the center, accused of eating a neighbor's grain. A rooster crows defiantly from the witness box, held by a trembling child. The judge, dressed in black robes and wielding a small gavel, calls the court to order, and the trial begins. You step closer, realizing that in this world, no creature is too small to answer for its actions. The mainstream historical fact is that animals really were prosecuted in European courts during the Middle Ages, from pigs and cows to insects and dogs. Records survive in France, Switzerland, and Germany, documenting trials where animals were formally indicted, defended, and sometimes executed. The rationale was practical as well as moral. Livestock could damage property, crops, or even children, and these trials offered a structured way to resolve disputes in a society that blended legal, religious, and communal norms. A pig might be excommunicated or hanged, a rooster condemned to a wooden stake, all as a lesson in divine justice applied universally. The quirky tidbit is that these proceedings were not always about punishment. They could be symbolic, offering closure to the community. One chronicler describes a beetle tried for devouring wheat seedlings. When found guilty, the villagers marched it to the river and ceremonially tossed it in, believing the act restored moral balance. Another case involved a goat accused of adultery with a woman's livestock. The animal was excommunicated and banished from the village for a month. You can't help but smile at the elaborate seriousness with which humans once insisted that animals understand the law. Sometimes the law itself became a spectacle. Processions, witnesses, scribes taking notes, all to assert that justice extended to every living being. The open scholarly debate revolves around interpretation. Were these trials genuinely believed to hold moral weight, or were they performative, reinforcing social order under the guise of piety? Some historians argue that trying animals was a way to maintain community cohesion and ritualize accountability. Others suggest that it was the logical extension of medieval beliefs in the moral universe, where sin and consequence applied to all life. Either way, the courtrooms were as much about humans as about animals, a mirror showing how seriously society treated rules, even when the defendant could not comprehend them. You watch the pig grunt, its snout pressed against the dirt, and for a moment you sympathize. The villagers present evidence: chewed corn husks, trampled seedlings, eyewitness testimony of a child. The rooster crows, flapping its wings, seemingly aware of the proceedings, or perhaps just agitated by the crowd. Lawyers, usually local parish priests, present arguments, some quoting scripture, others invoking common sense. The judge listens solemnly, occasionally adjusting his robes, and finally declares judgment. The pig will pay restitution in kind, returning the stolen grain, and the rooster will stand trial again next week if it continues its disturbances. The crowd murmurs approval, satisfied that order has been restored. You notice children collecting pebbles to toss into the pen as symbolic fines, a tiny act that somehow transfers moral responsibility from human to animal, or maybe just lets them play while feeling virtuous. A woman shakes her head, muttering that they'll be at this until the cows come home, which, in their world, might literally happen. You realize that these trials are not merely absurd, they are a window into the medieval mind, one where law, morality, and the natural world were intertwined, each reflecting the other in a delicate balance. The sun climbs higher, drying the morning mist, and the animals are led away, not unscathed but surprisingly alive. You breathe in the crisp air, thinking of pigs, roosters, beetles, and goats, and the stories they carried. Somewhere in the village a bell tolls, marking the hour, a reminder that human society marches on, even when it involves lectures for livestock. You step back, feeling the weight of centuries in every footprint, every wagging tail, every scribbled parchment. The lesson is clear. Belief, law, and spectacle often mingle in ways that make sense only in the context of the world that created them. And as you move away, the echo of the crowd's murmurs follows, a chorus of human determination insisting that, even in absurdity, order is possible. You leave the livestock courtroom and follow a narrow lane leading to the edge of the graveyard, where headstones lean like tired sentinels, and the air smells faintly of damp earth and lavender. Here lies the territory of the dead who still walk, the revenants and restless spirits that haunted medieval Europe. Villagers whisper that some corpses rise from their graves to walk at night, searching for revenge, for lost love, or simply for mischief. You step carefully, the mist curling around your boots, listening to the hollow groan of the wind through crooked tombstones. It feels as though the shadows themselves are alive, and every fallen leaf might conceal a restless hand. The mainstream historical fact is that fear of the dead was pervasive in medieval society, especially during outbreaks of plague or famine. Stories of corpses returning to haunt the living are documented across Germany, England, and Eastern Europe. People were genuinely concerned about improper burials, premature interments, and rituals failing to secure the soul's passage. The Church responded with exorcisms of graves, prayers over cemeteries, and even rituals for staking or decapitating corpses suspected of returning. Some of these practices, horrifying as they seem today, were attempts to restore order and prevent panic in communities already strained by death and disease. The quirky tidbit is that locals often had very specific techniques for preventing the dead from rising. A common method was to place rocks or iron objects in the coffin, or to sew a coffin shut with iron chains. In Eastern Europe, it was said that a corpse would be placed with its mouth full of garlic to repel vampires and revenants alike. One chronicler recorded a case where a corpse was laid facing down to trick it into digging downward instead of upward, a literal attempt to keep the dead where they belonged. You shiver at the absurdity, yet you can understand the fear. Nothing unsettles the living more than the possibility that the natural order itself has failed. The open scholarly debate today revolves around whether revenant tales were primarily psychological or social. Some argue they represented the communal anxiety surrounding mortality, especially in times of plague, and were reinforced by religious and cultural narratives. Others suggest that certain cases may have been inspired by natural decomposition processes, bloating, gases, and movement inside coffins that appeared inexplicable to those without anatomical knowledge. Either way, the myths reflect the medieval desire to assert control over death, to codify terror into manageable stories. You walk along the mossy path, past graves carved with angels frozen mid-flight. A faint rustling comes from behind a mausoleum. Your imagination jumps. Maybe it's a fox, maybe a stray dog, maybe a wandering soul. You remember the villagers who buried charms, left offerings, and performed prayers, tiny attempts to negotiate with forces they could not see. Every ritual, every precaution, every whispered incantation was part of a collective effort to prevent chaos from spilling into their nightly dreams. You crouch briefly, brushing your hand over a stone carved with a name barely legible. A reminder that every revenant story started with a real human life and ended as legend. A woman kneels beside a freshly dug grave, murmuring to the soil. You listen and realize she isn't just grieving. She's negotiating, bargaining, insisting that the boundary between life and death remain intact. Nearby, a priest sprinkles holy water over a family plot, invoking protection against restless spirits. The children peek from behind hedges, half curious, half afraid, absorbing lessons in fear that will last their lifetimes. The night hums with murmured prayers and cautious steps, a delicate balance between belief and terror. A crow perches on a leaning headstone, eyeing you with uncanny intelligence. You stare back, feeling that same primal unease that gripped medieval villagers. Somewhere beneath the soil, a body stirs, or perhaps it is just memory, imagination, or the wind pressing life into stillness. The boundary is thin. You take a deep breath, letting the chill of early evening settle into your bones. The dead may not walk, you reason, but the fear of them certainly does. As the last light fades and stars prick the sky, you realize the village is alive with whispers, warnings passed between generations. In these tales of revenants, the living and the dead are bound in a dialogue that ensures survival. Respect the deceased, honor their resting place, and perhaps, just perhaps, they'll honor you in return. You turn to leave the graveyard, the cool mist curling around your ankles, and feel the weight of centuries pressing gently against your shoulders. The dead are silent now, but their stories echo endlessly, reminding you that belief, whether grounded in fact or fear, has always been one of humanity's most potent lifelines. You leave the graveyard behind, walking down a winding path that smells faintly of wet straw and smoke, toward the village square where people are gathering again. This time, the tension is different, heavier, more urgent, the kind of energy that hums in the air before a storm. The topic of conversation is inevitable, the end of the world, or at least the dozens of doomsday predictions circulating in the past decade. Town criers shout in the market, proclaiming that comets, eclipses, and unusual weather are signs that Judgment Day approaches. Mothers clutch children, farmers pray over empty fields, and even the smith pauses mid-hammer stroke to glance nervously skyward. In medieval Europe, the apocalypse wasn't just a story, it was a calendar, a clock ticking in months, weeks, and sometimes hours. The mainstream historical fact is that eschatology was a central concern for both clergy and laity. Prophecies, from the Book of Revelation to local visions, predicted the end of the world repeatedly, and scribes meticulously recorded every celestial anomaly or famine as confirmation of divine wrath. Many European societies structured their festivals, fasts, and even tax collection around the anticipated arrival of the apocalypse, believing that preparation could spare them from God's judgment. Chroniclers like Joachim of Fiore built intricate timelines interpreting the world in 3 ages, each with signs to watch for. The belief was earnest, and the urgency palpable. It wasn't a story for entertainment, it was guidance for survival. The quirky tidbit is that doomsday anxiety led to bizarre social behaviors. In France, some communities sold all their possessions in panic, only to discover years later that nothing had changed. Children were taught to memorize prayers by night and flee the village by day, just in case the end came sooner than expected. One chronicler wrote of a man who built a salvation raft on a pond in his backyard, confident it would float him to safety when the rivers overflowed with fire. Another account describes villagers throwing animals into rivers as offerings, reasoning that if the world ended, at least the livestock would be protected. The logic is questionable, but the intent to gain control over the uncontrollable is unmistakably human. The open scholarly debate revolves around the psychological and social impact of constant apocalyptic expectation. Did these prophecies encourage moral behavior and community cohesion, or did they breed panic and exploitation by the ambitious? Some historians argue that religious leaders leveraged end-of-world predictions to enforce obedience, while others suggest the warnings served as communal exercises in mindfulness and preparedness. Both are likely true, depending on who held the quill and who raised the coins. You notice this duality as villagers prepare their fields, gather food, and pray simultaneously, the practical and the spiritual entwined like roots under the soil. You step into the square, observing families stacking grain sacks and barrels, talking over one another about signs in the heavens and omens in the weather. A child tugs at her mother's cloak, pointing to a hawk circling above. "Is that the angel of death?" she asks. The mother nods gravely. "Perhaps, perhaps not. We must be ready either way." The uncertainty is deliberate. It keeps attention sharp, heart steady, and faith alive. Nearby, a group of monks unfurls a long scroll detailing when comets and eclipses coincide with plagues or wars, a celestial warning system of doom. They chant softly, rhythms measured to impress not just God but also the people, reinforcing belief through repetition and ceremony. A sudden wind stirs, bending the thatch of nearby cottages and sending dust skittering across the cobblestones. You feel the same tension that must have gripped those centuries ago, the fragile understanding that the universe can shift without notice, that humans are small, and the end could be near at any moment. The villagers move deliberately, their pace slow, precise, governed by caution and hope. Some make offerings at crossroads, others light fires on hilltops to ward off the coming apocalypse. Everywhere, ritual blends with labor. Fear becomes structure. As evening falls, the sky deepens to a bruised violet. Lanterns flicker in windows, casting long shadows across the streets, and the sound of chanting drifts from the chapel. You linger for a moment, noticing how humans seem to thrive when there's a deadline, even a cosmic one. Predictions of the end have shaped societies, motivated behaviors, and bound communities in shared vigilance. Fear, you realize, is both a compass and a leash, guiding action and constraining chaos. You take a slow breath, inhaling smoke, earth, and candle wax, letting the rhythm of the town sink into you. Somewhere, someone will write another prophecy tomorrow, and someone else will believe it. The world doesn't end, not yet, but the anticipation shapes everything: how people build, pray, love, and fear. You turn to leave the square, the echo of prayers and clinking bells fading into the night. You feel the pulse of the Middle Ages in your own chest, a reminder that even when the world seems fragile, belief carries the weight of centuries, anchoring hope, fear, and human ambition all at once. You wander away from the anxious square, climbing a gentle rise where the grass is wet with dew and the horizon stretches like a pale promise. Before you lies a curious sight, an ancient, hand-drawn map spread over a stone altar, pinned down with small rocks and iron weights. It's a heavenly map, with Jerusalem at its center, rivers curling like ribbons, mountains etched in exaggerated relief, and monsters lurking at the edges, serpents, dog-headed men, and islands that might be whales. Every scribble, every symbol, every line conveys more than geography. It conveys belief, morality, and imagination fused into a single canvas. In the Middle Ages, maps were not tools. They were moral landscapes where every corner contained lessons, warnings, or divine observation. The mainstream historical fact is that such mappamundi really existed. The Hereford map in England, for instance, is a 13th century world map with Jerusalem central, biblical events illustrated, and unknown territories filled with fantastical beasts. These maps were educational, devotional, and navigational, reflecting both the known and the imagined. Mariners, pilgrims, and scholars alike used them to orient themselves in a world that was part physical, part moral, and part magical. Every river drawn had meaning. Every mountain symbolized something beyond topography, a spiritual or cultural landmark. The quirky tidbit is how often the unknown edges of these maps were decorated with monsters and exotic peoples. Dog-headed men, one-eyed giants, and fire-breathing serpents were carefully plotted in places no one had visited. Some chroniclers believed that if you ventured too far into these zones, the creatures might leap from the parchment into reality. One monk wrote that these illustrations served as both warning and amusement. Observe, and do not wander foolishly, lest curiosity end in peril. He advised while secretly delighting in the grotesque diversity of his imagination. The maps became a storytelling device, a way of making geography entertaining, moral, and terrifying all at once. The open scholarly debate lingers on whether these maps were intended literally or metaphorically. Did medieval people genuinely think dog-headed men roamed unknown lands, or were the illustrations symbolic, moral placeholders for chaos beyond comprehension? Some historians argue that the creatures represented internal and societal fears projected onto uncharted territories. Others insist the artists blended observation with imagination, documenting travelers' tales of strange lands distorted into cautionary illustration. Either way, the maps reflect the way humans have always navigated both the physical and ethical landscape of life. You kneel beside the altar, tracing a winding river with your finger. The path curves unnaturally, leading to a dark corner where a tiny island is drawn with scales and spikes. A faint shiver runs down your spine. You imagine what it would have been like to study these maps at the time. A guide to geography and morality. A way to make sense of a vast, unpredictable world. A nearby scribe adjusts his glasses, nods approvingly at your attention, and mutters a prayer for travelers' safety. The map hums with intent, and you realize that even on stone, human concern and imagination are inseparable. A crow caws somewhere in the distance, breaking the quiet, and the edges of the map seem alive in the morning mist. You notice tiny symbols for saints, angels, and even miniature cities, each annotated with warnings or blessings. They suggest routes safe for pilgrims, locations to avoid for moral or physical danger, and reminders of where divine intervention was believed to occur. The message is clear. Knowledge, faith, and storytelling are inseparable. Medieval people didn't just travel the world, they tried to map it with morality, caution, and imagination. As the sun rises, gold light spills across the altar and illuminates a corner where a group of children peeks over the stones, marveling at the illustrations. Their eyes widen at a sea monster, a dragon, and a city in flames. You smile, remembering how you too once saw magic in lines drawn by human hands. Each creature, each mountain, each river is a story that survived centuries, teaching caution, wonder, and the limits of perception. You rise and step back, realizing that the maps were never just guides, they were reminders that the world is vast, strange, and full of lessons, if only you know how to look. The morning breeze stirs the mist, and for a moment you feel the weight of history pressing gently against your shoulders. The unknown edges of the world, populated with monsters and marvels alike, remind you that every culture needs a way to wrestle with mystery. You take one last glance at the map before walking away, the images lingering in your mind, the monsters, the cities, the rivers, all merging into a single extraordinary landscape of human imagination, fear, and hope. You leave the map altar behind and descend into the village's marketplace, now quiet except for the occasional clatter of a cart or the distant bray of a donkey. Here lies the domain of omens and portents, a world where small signs were read as messages from God, angels or spirits that lingered just beyond sight. A black cat slinks across the square, and whispers follow it. Some say it brings bad luck, others that it protects against evil. A child points at a broken mirror in a puddle, and the elders shake their heads gravely. In the Middle Ages, everyday events were interpreted as cosmic signals, and no one ever walked through life unconcerned about their meaning. The world itself was alive, communicating constantly through shape, sound, and color. The mainstream historical fact is that medieval people meticulously observed natural phenomena to guide decisions, from the weather to animal behavior. Eclipse sightings, comets, abnormal births, and unusual weather patterns were carefully recorded in chronicles, often linked to political or social events. For example, a solar eclipse might be interpreted as divine displeasure, prompting fasts or prayers, while the birth of a child with unusual markings could be read as an omen for the kingdom's future. People believed the heavens and earth constantly conveyed moral and spiritual guidance, and ignoring signs was considered reckless. The quirky tidbit is that some omens were surprisingly specific. In one French town, it was believed that if a rooster crowed at midnight, a war would begin within the week. In another, the sudden appearance of a rainbow after a storm was said to signal the birth of a holy figure. Merchants might delay trade if a cat crossed their path in the wrong direction, and farmers would adjust planting schedules based on dreams interpreted by local wise women. Even mundane events were imbued with layered meanings, creating a lattice of superstition and social guidance that governed daily life. The open scholarly debate centers on the function of omens in medieval society. Were they genuine attempts to predict and influence the future, or social constructs to enforce communal behavior and moral codes? Some historians suggest omens provided psychological comfort in unpredictable times, offering a sense of control. Others argue they reinforced hierarchies and authority, giving clergy and scholars a role as interpreters of signs, capable of influencing decisions that affected entire villages. Either way, the belief system made the world intelligible in a time without scientific certainty. You stroll past a stall where an old woman sells bones, feathers, and trinkets as talismans to avert misfortune. Each item comes with instructions. Place this feather under your pillow to ward off nightmares. Carry this bone to avoid being struck by lightning. A young man buys a piece of chalk, claiming he will mark the doorframe to keep evil spirits from entering his home. You notice a group of children sketching patterns in the dirt, convinced that certain symbols will protect them from harm. The market, subdued in sound but alive with intention, feels more like a ritual than a place of commerce. A sudden wind lifts dust and straw into spirals, and you see a merchant quickly turn over a pot, saying that the wind brings messages from the gods. You pause to watch a mother place her child's hand against a cat, murmuring instructions for protection. The layers of belief are tangible. Superstition, ritual, and daily life fused seamlessly into a rhythm. The air is thick with expectation. Everyone seems alert to meaning, scanning for omens in movement, sound, and smell. You step aside as a man gestures toward the sky, claiming he saw 3 crows in a triangular formation, a sure sign of famine or plague. Villagers nod solemnly. A dog barks, and it is interpreted as a warning to the livestock. The world seems alive, constantly speaking in codes that only those trained or desperate enough could decipher. You realize that this heightened attention to detail, sometimes charming, sometimes oppressive, gave structure to lives defined by scarcity, disease, and uncertainty. As night approaches, lanterns are lit across the square, casting long, flickering shadows. You pause and consider the human desire to find patterns in chaos, to read meaning into everything from the flight of birds to the alignment of planets. Medieval Europe may seem superstitious now, but in that moment you understand the impulse. The world was full of danger, and interpretation was the only tool for survival. Omens offered a bridge between fear and understanding, imagination and reality, mortality and hope. You step away from the marketplace, the lanterns casting their golden glow across your path, and feel the pulse of centuries beneath your feet, a reminder that humans have always listened for messages, even when none were sent. You glance back one last time at the shadows twisting across the cobbles, at the flickering figures still reading signs in every movement and sound. You realize the lesson of omens, that in every whisper of wind or glint of light, people find a way to talk to the universe, and in doing so to each other. The world is vast, unpredictable, and sometimes terrifying, but full of signals for those willing to see. You walk into the darkening evening, carrying a sense of wonder as persistent and delicate as the belief itself. The path narrows as you leave the village behind, winding along the edge of the forest where the mist rises like the slow exhale of the earth itself. The air smells of wet leaves, smoke from distant chimneys, and the faint metallic tang of morning dew on iron tools left from yesterday's work. You walk slowly, savoring the quiet, feeling the rhythm of your own heartbeat blend with the soft rustle of unseen animals and the whisper of wind through skeletal branches. Every shadow seems alive yet not threatening, a gentle reminder that not all mysteries bite. Tonight, the journey reaches its final chapter, a place where your senses relax and the stories begin to settle like sediment, leaving only the gentle hum of imagination and memory. You breathe deeply, letting the cool air fill your lungs, and feel the centuries of belief, fear, and wonder rolling through you as if they were carried by the forest itself. You recall dragons, unicorns, mandrakes, and comets, the fantastical and the terrifying, stitched together in a tapestry of human curiosity. Each myth once demanded attention, shaping behavior, instilling caution, or inspiring awe. Even werewolves and revenants, the animals on trial, and the omens in the marketplace now seem softer, their edges smoothed by time. You notice how each tale shared a common thread, humans striving to understand their place in a vast, unpredictable world. Each story, whether about the heavens or the soil beneath your feet, became a way to navigate fear, mortality, and the unknown. The forest around you seems quieter now. Leaves drip with condensation, birds settle in branches, and the faint sounds of village life fade across the distance. You pause by a moss-covered rock, noticing a tiny sprig of lavender curling toward the fading sunlight, a small reminder that life continues quietly, even amid chaos. You think of the alchemists and their fires, the priests and their prayers, the villagers interpreting every twist of wind or flight of a bird. Each act was a gesture toward understanding, a way to balance the tangible and the unseen. Humanity, it seems, has always found a means to give shape to the unknown, and to comfort itself with meaning, no matter how fragile or fleeting. You walk slowly down the last slope, the moon rising to cast silver light over the land. Shadows lengthen and blur. The world softens in color and definition. You realize that the myths, however ridiculous or solemn, were never merely lies. They were lifelines. They gave people a framework to navigate danger, sorrow, and uncertainty. Even failed alchemical experiments or absurd court trials for animals held a deeper truth. People needed to believe that actions mattered, that justice or order could exist even in a chaotic world. You feel the pulse of this ancient logic in your own chest, a rhythm connecting centuries of human hope and imagination. The air grows cooler as night deepens, wrapping around you like a shawl. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolls softly, blending with the whisper of leaves and the faint murmur of water. You let your pace slow, each step deliberate, mindful, almost ceremonial. The stories you have walked through, the comets, the mandrakes, the alchemists, the revenants, the omens, linger gently in your mind. They are not meant to frighten, now, but to remind you that humans have always reached for meaning, have always tried to illuminate the dark corners of existence with creativity, belief, and ritual. Finally, you reach the edge of the forest. The village lights just a warm flicker in the distance. You pause and look back over the path you have traveled, the stories and lessons woven into every step. There is a soft stillness now, an almost tangible calm. The myths no longer demand fear. They offer reflection. You feel a profound connection to the past, to those who once walked these paths, watched the skies, feared the forest, and found comfort in belief. Slowly, deliberately, you breathe out, letting the tension of the journey ease from your body. The night sky stretches overhead, vast, calm, and infinite. Stars blink faintly, distant but steady, as though encouraging your own imagination to rest. You feel the lingering hum of centuries of stories, and it resonates within you like a gentle lullaby. The forest, the village, the comets, the creatures, and the rituals, all of it folds together into a quiet harmony, soft and reassuring. You take your final step forward, letting the darkness and the cool night air envelop you, and feel the gentle weight of stories settling, comforting rather than commanding. You walk onward slowly, your heart light, your mind softening, carrying with you the faint glow of every myth, every whisper, every lesson from the centuries past. Now, the night is still, your steps silent on the soft earth. The forest exhales, and you exhale with it, leaving behind the echoes of dragons, unicorns, comets, alchemists, revenants, and omens. Each story has done its work, fading into memory yet leaving warmth, wonder, and reflection behind. The journey is complete. The world is quiet, soft, and safe for a while. The hum of imagination fades gently as your eyes grow heavy and the mind begins to rest. Time stretches, slowing, lengthening, softening, and you feel the last tug of the ancient tales releasing you into calm, letting sleep take hold. Sweet dreams.